the Advisory Committee on Higher Education Cost Efficiencies. I think, as everyone knows, today our focus is on facilities, the planning, design, building, and operating of facilities, and as well as the financing thereof. And so, without further ado, I'm going to see if our commissioner has any comments he'd like to add, and then we'll jump into some pretty good panels that we have today.
No, one very brief comment. I wanted to call attention to an article that appeared yesterday in the Chronicle of Higher Education that cites a study that was commissioned at the University of California, Berkeley. As you know, the state of California is in a tough fiscal condition, and the higher education is in tough shape as well. And the University of California, Berkeley commissioned a study that was conducted by Bain and Company, and they found ways in which Berkeley could save up to $75 million a year by taking some fairly simple steps, and I'm going to make sure that every member of this committee has this report. We'll send you the link. And, it's interesting reading, and there's a good executive summary, so you don't have to read all 200 pages of it. So we'll get that to you.
Hopefully everybody's had a chance to read through the minutes of our March meeting, and so I would entertain a motion to approve those minutes.
Move for approval.
A motion from Richard. Second. Is there a second? Second from Roberto. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. So we now have approved minutes. The first panel we've got on facilities development and management of deferred maintenance involves Charles Matthews, the recently former Chancellor of Texas State University System, Peter Graves, Associate Vice Chancellor for Contract Administration with the Texas State University System, and Guy Bailey, there you are, Guy, President of Texas Tech University. So, gentlemen, welcome. David, do you have any comments you want to make before they kick off?
No, other than
you got to quit wearing a wire, Dave.
I'm supposed to let people know about that. No, I think you should all look forward to this panel. I think there's going to be a lot of very interesting ideas. I think some things that you probably haven't heard before, and I don't want to hold us back from hearing.
In 15 minutes, I don't know that I can do that, but I'll start. Let me begin.
Charles, just before you begin, let me just remind everybody the recommendations are categorized. The updated ones are in the front of your folder or on top of your folder. You also have the sheets to take notes. When you are speaking, if you would please bring the microphone towards you, that would help. And if our speakers can, while I have you all here, if you can stay for this afternoon for the committee discussions, that's when they have a lot of questions. We would really appreciate it. I don't know what the committee's on. Anything else? Strict time schedule. Already talked to these first three guys, and so I'll be kind of ringing a bell and giving you a little warning.
And as always, the bios for our distinguished speakers are in your packet.
Okay, Charles.
Can I begin now? All right. They've asked me first to talk about Hurricane Rita. I tell the story like this. I'd been Chancellor 7 months whenever my president of Lamar called one Saturday morning and said the hurricane just hit. I left my police chief back in a bunker, and he told me it's really, really bad. And I said to him, well, I'll tell you what, while everybody else is walking up and down the street looking at all the trees and buildings that are down, I want you talking to contractors, because there's not going to be enough contractors to go around, and there's sure not going to be enough good ones. So we, within 2 hours, had our general contractor hired to start fixing it up. I also told him, don't worry about cost. I'll take care of that. That's my job. You just go and get it fixed, and I'll raise the money. And, I called around, and our schools are kind of poor, and I've raised $5 million in a couple of days. I thought it was great. When I called Dr. Simmons, he said, well, I've already spent $17 million. He began to look at this, and you can see what happened to us. Lamar University got the majority of it, about $60 million worth of damage. We had 125 buildings damaged, 20 buildings without any roofs at all. we put this thing back together in 23 days. In 23 days, we were running classes, and anybody that was going to graduate in December graduated. Anybody who wanted to finish that semester finished it. I'll have to tell you that when I told the president and the provost that we were going to reopen, we were not going to lose a semester, if they'd have been closer, I'd have been dead, because they were very angry, because faculty was spread everywhere, and you can see the devastation here. If you looked at my resume, you see that I've done a lot of stuff. I mean, I've even totaled up the amount of construction I've been involved in. Maybe it's $6 to $7 billion. I mean, I've done a nuclear power plant. I've built a coal-fired power plant. I've built a lot of things over the years, and so I've learned some hard lessons. And the first one is, particularly in an area like Beaumont, is you want to move quickly. The average rainfall in Beaumont is 53 inches a year. So you need to get in there with dryers and blowers and start pulling out sheetrock, because it'll wick right up the walls. Some of those walls we cut 3 times trying to stop the mildew. The other thing that I learned that first week is that state government was self-insured. I had no insurance. I could not believe it. I could just picture the legislative meeting that occurred where they were trying to balance a budget one year, 20 years ago, and somebody says, well, I know how to do it. We just won't pay insurance premiums. And that was really tough with a system like ours. I mean, we are not UT, we're not A&M. We don't have the puff to go back to. The balances are small. And then we had to depend on the Legislative Budget Board, who at the time was not meeting. The 3 principals did not get along, and I couldn't get them to meet. They kept promising me they would meet. I had no money. The contractors began suing me after a while. They wanted their money. And it was a mess. Finally, the legislature, in May of the second year, this happened in 05 and 06, did a special appropriation for me, and it was $37.5 million for the four Lamars. It took us probably a year to get it done. I want Peter, well, I'm going to wait for just a minute to turn over to Peter. A couple of things that I want to say to you. After this event, the legislature put in place the State Office of Risk Management. And the idea was that everybody in state government would participate in that pool, that insurance pool, so that the folks who bought insurance would have reasonable rates. The unfortunate thing about that is 4 of our largest institutions opted out. TxDOT is not a member of it. University of Texas System is not a member of it. A&M System is not a member of it, and I'm sorry to say Tech is not a member of it. That needs to change. I mean, we need as many people in that as we can to reduce those insurance premiums. They are too high, and we need to spread the risk. We need the people in South Texas being offset by the folks in West Texas, and when the West Texas folks have a tornado, we need to be able to offset it with the folks in the southern part of the state. So I would suggest that's something that you should do. The other big issue that we ran into, and then I'm going to get out of this, is when we started trying to figure out what our costs were. I understood right away that we were going to have the state auditor all over us. And so immediately what I did was use our internal auditors to start auditing construction cost and bills, and we sent those things back, and that all worked great. The state auditor audited us 2 or 3 times. The last time they said they reviewed almost 1 billion bills. I mean, over 900,000 bills, and we were all correct on all of that. The big issue that we had was over lost revenues. How do you estimate lost revenues? I mean, we were in the middle of a semester. A lot of those kids left. We had expenditures out. The president's trying to figure out how to pay his overhead, which is a real consideration for us. And in spite of now 4 hurricanes to those schools, we still don't have anybody that's put in place a standard for what you should be able to charge or to receive in state aid for lost revenues. If you look at the state audit that has been done for A&M at Galveston, the University of Texas Medical School down there, and the Lamars, you will find that the standards of what could be lost revenues are all 3 different. And the only person I know that can do this is a coordinating board. You need to decide what it is these schools can charge and what they can't. Now, you're talking about a lot of money here. And in schools that are general academics, where they don't have large reserves, places like Jesse Rogers schools, I mean, there's no rich granddaddy back there, and it is very, very tough. I mean, I met with a speaker to show you how critical this was. I met with a speaker in January, I guess, of 2006, and told him they were letting us draw forward our second year of the biennium of our general revenue, that my cash projection showed that by August I'd be $18.5 million underwater. And I went to speak with him to tell him that we were going to close the 4 Lamars down. There was not any way that we could pay the faculty salaries and operate. There was no way to do it. And he wanted me to keep it open until January. I guess we were until January when the legislature would be in regular session, and hopefully that month that they would get it done. And I says, I just can't do that to people. I can't do that. And so the legislature was kind enough to do a special item. I'd say those are the lessons I learned there. The lessons I learned when I came to the system, the background of building large projects, and began to look at the way we built projects in the Texas State University system. And the system was building about $300 million worth of projects a year. The board was unhappy about cost overruns. They were unhappy about the fees we were paying, various professional services. And so after looking at that and reflecting on some of the things I'd done in the past where costs had gotten out of control, I decided we were going to go at this differently, and that the person in charge of construction was going to be somebody that, as I teased my friend Peter Graves, didn't know a hammer from a nail, because it didn't really matter. That what I wanted was, I wanted a contractor relationship, and as I explained it to Peter when I brought him over, I believe in the golden rule, and we have all the gold, and I expect us to rule. So we spend a little time at the beginning making sure that we have tied down our contractor relationship with architects and engineers, construction manager at risk, whoever we bring in, so that we've not had those kinds of problems. We don't have overruns. We simply never had an overrun on a project in the 5 years that we ran it. And we estimated, I mean, and all of you that deal with money in this, certainly folks as well qualified as Elmo here, who I'm going to be careful about, but we estimated that we were saving about 10% of our cost and the way we run it. For one time, it was just Peter Graves running everything. We used an outside consultant to give us advice, and we had a person in there that we paid by the hour that was in the office, and when we needed him, we paid him, when we didn't, we sent him home. And that worked well, and I finally broke down after 3 years and gave Peter an assistant, and finally he got a secretary. But anyway, we ran it like that, and that's a hard way to do the job. But my deal was, all of us in system offices and administration have a responsibility to hold down the cost. If you ever looked on my website, you saw I've tried to figure out what my job description would be. I said it should be to make decisions every day to lessen the upward pressure on tuition and fees, so more ordinary kids can get a job. And so we fought those battles pretty hard. I'm going to let Peter tell you a little bit about what he did, and then I'll wrap up with a couple of comments here.
Okay, well, happy to do that. Our system, one of the reasons we were able to be as nimble as we were is because, as many of you doubtless know, our system office operation is very lean. We do not manage construction projects out of the system office. We manage the contractual relationships and the procurement and the legal part of that out of our office, and also the accountability that's necessary to ensure that our Board of Regents makes well-informed decisions on projects. But I don't have a staff of project managers, obviously, from the description that Charles gave you. So it was in a sense a little easier for us to make some fairly radical changes. Most of the work that I have done on this I would describe as a micro level work. As Charles described, our mission was to try to do what we could as a system office to keep costs under control. And it's easier in the area of cost efficiencies to identify the problems than it is to apply solutions. But one of the problems that exists, particularly in our system, where we do not actually actively manage projects out of the system office, is that we're insulated. I think one of the values that a system can offer in this area that is much more difficult for a campus to do is that we're somewhat insulated from the pressures that the campuses face. The folks that I work with on the campuses are in a situation where the most important thing in the facilities area is to have facilities quickly. And as anybody who's involved in facilities will tell you, you do that at a price. If time is the most important element on your facility plate, then you'll pay a premium for that. You can get that, but it costs. And because that tends to be the campus climate, one thing we can offer is a counterbalance to that and try to encourage planning to minimize that problem. Of course, in a campus situation, a lot of times you're driven by the academic year. You can't have, if you have a classroom facility delivered on October the 20th, that's not really very optimal. If you have a football stadium delivered in November, that's really not optimal. So there are real constraints that have to be dealt with. And so planning becomes very, very important. And so one of the things that we can do as a system office is to try to encourage that process to occur in a way that minimizes the upward pressure on costs. The other thing that I think is the hidden element when you're talking about cost efficiency is not only what are you spending, and we tried very diligently with some success to keep our projects within certain cost parameters and used information and are still using information that the coordinating board develops in order to help us figure out where our projects fall on the cost spectrum and to advise our board of regents so that they can decide where should we be aiming in terms of cost. Our institutions tend not to be the wealthiest ones on the block, and so it's important. It's important for everyone, but it's particularly important for them, to not pay too much. But the other hidden part is to get what you pay for. It's much more difficult to tell, particularly if you're an administrator in a university setting. You can tell whether you met the budget. What you can't tell is whether it was the right budget and whether you got the right building for that budget. And so that's a much more difficult task. It takes people with some real skills and experience in the facilities area, and as Charles described, my background, as my bio will tell you, my background is legal. So my job is to make sure we bring those people into play and let them give us that advice. But it doesn't help if you stay within budget if you wasted part of that budget and didn't get the building that you needed, or if you were forced early on because of poor planning to give up part of the building that you needed to meet the budget, only to find out at the end of the project that you have the money left over. You don't want the money, you want the building. You need the building. You decided up front that you needed the building. So those are some of the things that are really important, I think, to focus on, and that we, because we are somewhat insulated from the pressures that the campuses face, that as a system office we can offer. And so that's been a lot of our focus over the past 4 years as we've tried to address these problems. In the current cost environment, it's given us some relief because we're now seeing projects come in at less than we have estimated, but we still have the task of making sure that that money is properly spent. And just because we're getting the building cheaper than we thought we were, we need to make sure that we are in fact getting the building we want and that our resources are being well used. The other thing I thought I would mention just in these brief comments, because it is part of what I know the committee is looking at, is the issue of capital budgeting for not only new facilities but deferred maintenance. New facilities are very exciting. The legislature likes them much more than the legislature likes infrastructure and deferred maintenance. And so it is difficult, again, looking at the pressures that campuses face, it is difficult to encourage the kind of investment in infrastructure and deferred maintenance that is really absolutely critical. And in a time of declining resources for capital projects, my encouragement to you would be not to neglect that, not to see, deferred maintenance almost has a kind of a negative connotation, but it's the heart and soul of a physical plant operation. And our campuses have enormous capital value. I mean, they are large assets, and if in the rush to make sure that we have adequate facilities for our expanding schools, which is also an extremely important priority, if we wind up neglecting the investment in our infrastructure, the new buildings are not going to help us that much. We'll have problems getting electricity and chilled water to them. We'll have more expense than we would have had if we had paid attention to those facilities. And I think in our system, where those challenges are the most acute are in the campuses that really do have very, very tight budgets. I mean, they really, and some of these are campuses with aging infrastructure, and so it becomes a very, very serious challenge to do that in a way that meets the needs of the campus for safety, for maintaining their present facilities, and also for planning for the future.
Especially we wrap it up.
So, yeah.
I'm going to give you one example of what he talked about. Saul Ross has got 2 boilers there to provide all of the chilled water.
Charles,
Pardon me. Both of those boilers are over 60 years old. The cost, they're losing 30% of the steam out of their steam lines as they go from the boiler to the buildings. The president there tried for 3 legislative sessions to get the legislature to give him money for deferred maintenance. I mean, he's got a problem. Those boilers are going to blow up one day. You know, it gets cold occasionally in Alpine, and we've never been able to come up with the money to do that. That campus that's an older campus. That campus is always in trouble with the state fire marshal because they're not up to date with ADA issues. There simply is no money. There simply is not the money to do that. And that was the biggest challenge that I had with that campus. But at the smaller campuses, I mean, they're having a hard time with these issues, and that's a good example. I want to quit. I'll say what I've got to say in the question and answer session. I want to be very fair to my colleague Guy Bailey here.
Well, thanks very much. I appreciate that, and I'll try to make one suggestion about the chillers. As we go along.
Okay, good.
First thing I want to do, and again, I'll try to be very, very brief as well, and make sure I've got there's some structural issues with higher education that this is, I think, worth thinking about. For the last 20 years, I've tried to figure out how to get things done in a quick way in higher education. That's not the easiest thing. I don't think I'll get a lot of disagreement there. That sometimes change is slow, but I think there's some structural reasons with that. One thing to keep in mind is that our core mission is education, but we do a whole lot of things not directly related to teaching, research, and service. We feed students, house students, park students, right? We have big parking concessions, and so there are a lot of times we print stuff. We do a lot of things that aren't related to that core mission, and again, that'll be important to what I want to talk about a little later. The other thing on university campuses, the generation of revenue bears no relationship most of the time to how that revenue is allocated. And again, that causes some dysfunction. Remember that we generally cross-subsidize a lot of things on campus. It doesn't cost the same thing to educate a prospective teacher as it does a prospective engineer, but we charge the same thing for both of those. So the allocation of revenue and the generation of revenue don't bear a relationship. Another thing that's kind of important to keep in mind, university faculty members get their prestige and ultimately higher salaries, not from what they do for their universities, but what they do for their disciplines. That's a dysfunction that you always have to, if you got to kind of get things aligned there. And then the other thing about Ivory sealing my wife's term there, if you're a faculty member, you can reach full professor pretty early on in your career. I think I was hit full professor at 39. So that meant that had I not gone into administrative things for the next 30 years, I might have gotten 3-4% pay raise a year, and there was no other real benchmark So anyway, if you keep those things in mind and wonder why things sometimes are hard to change, I think that's it. Some issues in facilities development, and a lot of these concern us at Texas Tech right now. You have to think about the type of student body, whether it's residential, commuter. We're a heavily residential school. If you go to Texas Tech, you come there, 2/3 of our students live more than 300 miles away. So, we have a significant part, more than a 6-hour drive away. We have a significant part of our student body who comes to Lubbock simply to go to school, residential campus, and that creates some different kinds of challenges. And then the student mix of graduate, undergraduate students is important there too. Enrollment growth as a result of that doesn't affect all universities the same way. When we anticipate aggressive enrollment growth in the next 10 years, is maybe as many as 10,000 new students. We've got significant housing issues, for instance, that we have to deal with, and all 10,000 of them, unfortunately, are going to bring cars. So we've got to deal with that issue too. Then there's increasing competition for students and student expectations. I asked a group of our students how many of them had ever shared a bedroom. None of them had. I asked how many had shared a bath. A couple of them had. When my late mother-in-law came to Texas Tech in 1944, one woman on campus had a car. The expectations of students have changed, and we compete with good students, and so that drives some things as well. New technologies and dated facilities. We have a gorgeous campus. If you've not visited, I want to invite you. It's absolutely gorgeous, but many of our facilities were built sometime in the past, and as technologies have changed, those buildings need updating. The other thing, and again, this is something we're focused on a lot right now, and I want to talk about a little bit. A lot of our facilities, or some of our facilities, are used for non-core functions. They're used for things other than teaching, research, and service. If you can capture that space somehow, you can create space, I think, more efficiently and less expensively than otherwise. And then there really isn't a good incentive for faculty members and administrators to make efficient use of space. If you're at the English department, you don't pay for the space you use. Somebody gives it to you, so the more space you can sort of get the provost to give you, you've done something. And there isn't really, we're trying to build in some incentives and disincentives for the use of space there. And then limited capital for construction, and most people like me aren't exactly finance experts. Now, I have had the great advantage of working with Cecil Phillips, and I promise when you listen to Cecil, you'll learn a lot more than when you listen to me. So, in any event, all of these are issues that we have to deal with. Some principles we're trying to use at Texas Tech. First of all, we're trying to focus on the core mission and outsource things that aren't part of the core mission whenever possible, and capture that space. And I'll tell you about an example of that in just a minute. We're also revising our budget model so that there is an alignment of the generation of revenue and the allocation of revenue, and you essentially remember, academic units generate almost all the revenue we have through teaching or through research, whether that's through tuition or the state funding formula. And so we're trying to allocate or make our allocations line up with the generation of revenue, and then have people pay for space. You have to pay for the space you use it more efficiently. So, and then a principle here: somebody else will build it for you. Let them do it. I mean, it's a real good thing there. There are a lot of things that we do that other people would like to be involved in, and some public-private partnerships are options here. And then the last bullet point I actually stole from Cecil Phillips in a presentation I heard him give. So Cecil, I'm giving you full credit for this. The whole notion of a concession sale, and as I said, we do a lot of revenue-generating activities that private businesses could do just as easily and would love to do. And again, there's some space implications for those things. So I want to talk in a little more detail about the public-private partnerships and some alternatives there. And I'm going to talk about some things I did when I was in Kansas City as a chancellor there, and also a couple things that are going on right now at Texas Tech. If you think about public-private partnerships and constructions, that's really simply an extension of kinds of things that we began doing a while back, and bookstores are a good example. Most universities don't run their bookstores, but when I was in college, all universities did. It's something that we couldn't do nearly as effectively or as efficiently as one of the private vendors. And so food service is another thing. If you think about the history of higher education, when the university was built in Lubbock or in College Station or Stillwater, Oklahoma, you had to do all this for students. I mean, you had to provide the food service and the housing. There was not really a... But again, we've developed private partnerships, public-private partnerships to do a lot of these things now, and that can be extended to construction as well. And if you look at what universities bring to a partnership, I mean, we've got land, and in many cases, very valuable land. We've usually got a non-profit status and a captive market, and in many cases, the possibility for significant growth. And private partners can bring things like capital and capacity for building things quicker, and also knowledge, and maybe in some cases off-balance financing. That's a complicated issue, but anyway, some examples of things we've done through public-private partnerships. But before I do that, I want to talk about one thing we're doing right now. As some of you know, we're one of the 7 emerging research universities, and that's been a topic of great discussion and an issue of great excitement on our campus. It really has generated tremendous interest, excitement, activity. It makes it a great place to be. Now, one of the problems we don't have sufficient research space, you think immediately about building that space, but what we've begun to do is think about what space on campus can we capture? What are we doing that we don't have to do? I found out that we have a print service, and so we had a print tech on our campus. And the more I looked into it, I realized that, first of all, 60% of the business went off campus anyway. So we're only doing 40% of the business. What was really bad is that some of the business they were doing, they were outsourcing. And they were outsourcing it to OU. That was really bad. So I thought, this is an activity we don't need to be doing. By the way, it's 30,000 square feet. And so we simply are outsourcing all of our printing. We are eliminating the print tech. We'll redesign and renovate that building. And again, to build a 30,000 square foot building in the core of our campus, $15 to $18 million, it'll cost, I don't know, $2 to $5 million to do the renovations we want. We've saved a pretty good bit of money simply by identifying an activity that was not core to our mission, outsourcing that activity, and capturing this space. And that's our first priority. What space can we recapture, and can we renovate to get that way? Some things we did in Kansas City that using public-private partnerships. When I got to Kansas City, I learned to, if you go outside of Texas, you really learn to appreciate the state. And, we may sometimes complain about higher education funding and so forth here, and go somewhere else. Go to Missouri, and you'll appreciate some things. There are no tuition revenue bonds, for example, there. And so for many years, the University of Missouri, Kansas City had not built buildings or replaced things. We had the same chiller plant issue, and a very beautiful old campus, old facilities, and the chillers would go out, and it gets very cold there in the winter and very hot in the summer. So the question is, how are you going to replace those? And I really didn't have any money to do it, so we talked to a private firm, Burns & McDonnell, and tried to get their advice, and they said, look, we think that you can create enough energy savings to debt finance new chillers. And so they did an audit for us. This is something they did free. They did an energy audit for us. We took every suggestion they made. We scripted some money up front, and some of these were as small as changing all the light bulbs and the bathroom fixtures. Some were larger, but we took all that, and then we debt financed the replacement of chillers that way. A great example of how a private partner helped us out, and we were able to scrimp together some money to do that. And again, there would have been no other way to replace the chillers, and so the energy savings then were what we used to debt finance, and that's worked out pretty well. So at the University of Missouri, Kansas City also had we had some serious problems with housing too. We had some very attractive programs, and we had a lot of students coming to live there, but we had no campus life and no housing. And I think everybody knows that the students who live on campus, especially their first year or two, do much better. And so we wanted to build housing. Again, we had no revenue for doing that. And I had some other construction needs as well. Now, the one thing I did have was very valuable land not far from the plaza, which is a great shopping area. And so we entered into a public-private partnership, actually, with Cecil Phillips. And essentially, Cecil built housing for us. We did a ground lease, and Cecil built the housing and worked very carefully with us so that we got the programming we needed. And then we used the revenue from the land lease. We pledged that revenue toward we had to expand our library for some space for student use in the library. So we pledged that toward an expansion of the library and expansion of our music conservatory. So we were using the revenue here's what I needed out of this. I needed housing and I needed revenue. And what I had was land. So I brought the land to Cecil, and he provided the housing and some revenue that would from a ground lease. And then that revenue enabled me to do some construction that I would have otherwise not been able to do. So what we were able to do through the public-private partnership achieved the need that we had, and then not for housing but also for revenue as well. Other things that we were looking at, parking facilities. Remember, that's a huge concession there, and research parks and buildings as well. Okay, just some conclusions here. We're going to need a significant number of new facilities over the next half century if we add 10,000 students and we grow our research the way we want. They're probably not going to be met with conventional financing mechanisms or in conventional ways, and so we're looking at outsourcing non-core activities, creating efficiencies, and then some public-private partnerships as well to try to make these things happen. And when we get to the question and answer session, I'll be happy to talk further. Thank you.
And we're at the question and answer.
You're there. Jesse?
Sorry to be first to have so many questions. I'll try to roll it into one.
Good luck with that.
I think today we are talking about a financial fix that could save universities in the state significant amounts of money. It's not just our university, but that's the only reference I have. And Charles, I think you and Peter and Guy really hit on it. Our campus, we started building in 1938. We moved from our old campus, which we started in 1922, thank goodness. But a big part of our campus was built in the 30s and even in the early 60s. Like I say, it's a beautiful campus. You drive through it, but we have to change the function of rooms and buildings almost constantly because of the needs of the student body, the changes in technology. Deferred maintenance is the bane of my existence. It seems like the projects that range from, I'll pick a number, $100,000 to $500,000 to convert rooms to laboratories or change laboratories, or the kinds of things that we constantly do, or put in new windows, all of the things we have to do, end up costing significantly more than at least my board thinks that it should. And we've tried various ways of contracting. I'll give one example. We put out an RFP this year, picked a contractor we knew, did good work, but we said, you have everything up to $500,000 for our $50,000 and up projects. Price went up dramatically. And I think I can understand probably the folly of that. But yet bidding out every small project, and again, my board doesn't understand, it's the state. It's not like repainting your home and changing the bathroom. We have ADA considerations, fire safety consideration, asbestos consideration. What do you all do about the smaller projects? It's eating us up financially, and it's needed deferred maintenance or changing the campus. That kind of wraps it all up.
I think I can speak to that. You've identified the problem. The typical solution to that is job order contracting, which it sounds like you've done with a single vendor. The danger, the good part about job order contracting is that you can accomplish what you're trying to do, which is to have someone available without having to go through, multiple procurements every time you've got a small, which doesn't make any sense. The bad part about job order contracting is that it is a relatively expensive way to deliver to deliver construction services. The way that I have seen that's probably most successful at fixing that is to do a couple of things. First of all, and it depends kind of on the market that you're in and what the contractor mix is and what people are willing to do. The more, the more you're in an area where there's a lot of competition, the better this works, is having more than one source. In other words, go out with a procurement, but wind up with 2 or 3 job order contractors, and have as a part of your contract with them that you're going to go, typically you go with RS Means, which is a standard construction cost manual, but make them compete with you on discounts from that. We pay in the components that we have who do this typically get fairly attractive discounts off the rack rate, from the RS Means cost estimating guide. But I think they're able to do that because these folks know that there's more than one provider there. And then, establish caps for each one and make sure that your facilities folks spread the work around so that nobody begins to feel like, they've got the bird's nest on the ground.
Is that one of your...
Yeah, one of our
state?
components uses this pretty successfully. But don't pay rack rate and make sure that you build competition into the solution.
Well, deferred maintenance for all of us is costly.
Well, it is. These are small projects, and you
Yes.
can't. The economies of scale are not there.
No.
And so,
Raymond?
Question on deferred maintenance. You described a couple of things that I would not put in the deferred maintenance category. Changing a laboratory to another use or off a classroom to a laboratory. I would call deferred maintenance, and deferred maintenance in my mind is an oxymoron, that term, because deferred and maintenance don't go together. But deferred maintenance, to me, is things like, well, I'm not going to fix that roof. I'll get another 5 years out of it, and all of a sudden I have thousands and tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars of water damage in my library and things like that. Why is it that we can't get people to pay attention to deferred maintenance or to maintenance in general? We have it in our highway system. We have it any public facility, public capital asset. We don't pay attention to maintenance.
It's because the funding is not there. Well, it's not sexy to allocate money for maintenance. I've made those talks repeatedly to the legislature in various places I've served. And it just doesn't happen until we figure out a way to designate a revenue stream exclusively to maintenance. It's probably not going to happen. Members of the legislature get a lot of pleasure out of being able to come back home and say, I was able to help get an appropriation that's going to build a new library. It's going to serve lots of kids. It's going to be wonderful. It's going to be named after somebody we all know. Those are easy, but I can't remember. There's some experienced government affairs people sitting back here who probably have been doing this a lot longer than I have, but I can't remember successful attempts to get deferred maintenance money from the legislature. There simply is not enough money to go around.
It seems to me like it's a waste of public resources if we don't pay attention to maintenance, and I think that, Mr. Chairman, that's something that we ought to highlight in our report.
It's anecdotally, it's the elephant in the room at all our institutions. And it's not there are what I used to call 3R work. It's not just the repairs that we think of as deferred maintenance. It's also retrofitting buildings, and it's also repurposing and renovating buildings. And the A&M campus in College Station just completed a study that they're going through and vetting now, but they have 10 years and $1.5 billion of that type of work, and that's just one example. You could probably take that number and triple it, maybe quadruple it, and come up with a very rough guess at the statewide needs. How do we, to piggyback on that, Charles, you put your finger on the fact we haven't identified a dedicated source of revenue for deferred maintenance. What are the legislature, and they're not going to find it this next session.
This next session is not the time.
They're going to turn that around. They're going to say, what do we need to do to incentivize our campuses and our systems to carve out part of their budget for deferred maintenance?
Well, I identified a revenue stream a few years ago, and that when Craddock was Speaker, we were having conversations, and Craddock wasn't Speaker anymore, and it went away. But my years at the Railroad Commission, I watched the oil and gas industry fund, all of the money in the rainy day fund is coming from severance tax. The last few years, it was mostly natural gas. Now it's primarily oil, I'm sure. But the severance tax on gas is so high that it didn't take real high gas prices to generate a lot of revenue. The $9 billion number you keep hearing about the rainy day fund is all coming from oil and gas revenue. And what I suggested because of the TRB, there's a lot of opposition to the legislature to do any more TRBs. We may never see any more TRBs. And after this session, it would have been a pretty good little while since we've seen any. I suggested to the Speaker that we allocate $1 billion out of the rainy day fund. And there I was talking about construction projects, not maintenance, and then force the universities, the colleges, to pay cash for their construction, to not finance any debt. Some of the folks that are experts on debt around here will tell you that when you do a 30-year bond, or you basically have doubled the cost of the project, and so pay cash for those projects. And then, of course, you get to the real issue, and that is how do you allocate that money through all of the colleges? That's a really tough nut that nobody's really figured out very well. When you looked at the allocation of the last big TRB, and we had, I think it was $1.5 billion. I think two systems wound up with $1.1 billion of that. Those were not the poorest systems in the state. We got a little over $100 million in that at campuses in 12 cities. I mean, I've got Lamar's not had a new building on it since 1978 on the entire campus. I mean, there's not a fair allocation of resources, and what you're going to find is what Jesse's just described, and I would say that would fit most of the smaller general academics across the state. Is that because most of them were originally started as teaching colleges. The formula funding, I know funding is low. They don't teach a lot of hard sciences. That's changing a little bit, but there's not any way for them to effectively do what they need to do with the way the money's allocated. It's just simply not enough to do it. I mean, there are some things that, and it's going to force us. I mean, here I spent a lot of time thinking about this whole money issue, because when you look at the projected population growth of the state and you see what's about to happen, and you realize that those are poor people, it appears to me that the legislature in their deliberations going forward are going to have to begin to reallocate the money, and they're going to have to put more money. They're going to take money away from the normal money that goes to the operation of a university or college, and more of that money is going to have to go to grants. Those people are poor. They're going to need a way to go to school. It's important to the state that we have a high percentage of college graduates. So it's going to make it even worse. So that gets me to the place where you are with this committee, and that is, what do we do? What do we do to really do something besides nibble around the edges? And you're going to have to start, in my view, you're going to start thinking in a different way than we think. We were having a conversation earlier about one of the problems with the regional schools. One of the issues that he would have in Wichita Falls, because a lot of these folks are my friends from the oil business, is that they believe that college belongs to them. That's not the case. Most colleges are paid for by taxpayers all over the state. We are not effectively using the purchasing power of our universities and our colleges. I mean, total up what the budgets are for everybody. And why are we not, we'll change it a little bit. Why are we not buying electricity in one contract? Why don't we buy natural gas for heating with one contract? Why are we not buying computers with one contract? Why are we not buying software? This makes no sense. These are the same taxpayers that are paying for all of this stuff. And I would say to you that we've erected artificial barriers around all of these institutions, and we really, my years in government, the thing that I've learned absolutely, and it doesn't matter whether it's city, Rich and I knew each other back in a different life. In government, if you're in government, many times, I won't say all the time because that's not fair, many times control is more important than cost. And we've got caught in that mindset of, well, yeah, I might be able to save some money by doing it a different way, but I want control in my institution or in my campus or in my state agency or in my city government or my school district. And I'm saying to you that with a huge challenge that Texas has in trying to educate this population, all of that's going to have to be looked at differently. I mean, what we started doing in our place, our system was looking at distance education more, because I kept saying to my folks, we cannot expect the legislature to fund, a faculty to student ratio of 1 to 20. It's not going to occur. The money is not going to come. I mean, Texas State's having enormous growth. That money is not going to come to continue to fund that growth. You're going to have to look at delivering things differently. What I said to my presidents as a goal, we need to think about a quarter of every degree should be offered online. I mean, you're going to have to rethink this whole thing. The old paradigm is no longer going to work. It's just not. If you know anything about economics, it's just simply not going to work. You have to really take a hard look at it.
Let me, Scott, you've got a question. I'm going to ask a funny follow-up.
Scott, and then
Scott
Mike.
and Mike, and Harvey.
And Harvey one.
First of all, at the direction actually the coordinating board, I served on a group a year or so ago related to a number of technical issues. And to me, one of the recommendations that I thought had great merit was related to deferred maintenance, and it did require a funding tool from the state, but it was designed to gear at about a 1.25% of the replacement value of the education general fund buildings, not the auxiliary buildings on the campuses. And that would be funded. It would need to be matched then by the campuses. So in order to access those funds, campuses would have to fund their own resources, grant or dedicated an equal amount up to 1.25%. That would then generate about 2.5% of replacement value toward deferred maintenance, which and you can argue about the standards, but as a general rule of thumb, amount to maintain and continue to maintain buildings. And I thought with the match component, it would create difficulties on campuses, it would create difficulties in the state, but at least it put something on the table that I thought had some merit. In relationship to just a couple of comments, and our situation is much different. We're a very large system. We have a $6.5 billion capital construction program. We bring about $1 billion of projects online. There are really three elements. There is the construction element of that, and there are a lot of things that are being done both in our system and throughout the state in trying to maximize and gain efficiencies in construction, and it is an ongoing challenge. We have great successes that we could talk about in our system, and we have failures where we need to do better. I will, just to put on the record, tell you how appreciative we are at UT for the best value statute. I've worked in states where it is a lowest responsive bid, and while that may seem a more cost-effective avenue, I will tell you it is not. And being able to evaluate contractors based on value is for us a great advantage that we have that many states do not. The construction ties a lot to maintenance and how we design buildings, not necessarily how we deliver it, but how we design them in terms of future maintenance has become a critical issue in our system. We're looking a lot in terms of useful lives. The days of building 40 buildings or longer in some cases may make sense, but I'll tell you, even in research, where the technology and the things change, they become obsolete, even if it was a building that you wanted as a signature component. And so we're trying to examine what it does mean to build a 20 or 25 year useful life piece. The other area that I just would indicate where I think we're going to have to have the greatest creativity, because I do think we're making inroads in terms of construction and maintenance, but it really goes back to utilization. And I know there are a lot of areas in which things are being done in campuses. Some of the smaller campuses and community colleges are well ahead of some of the more traditional, larger institutions in some ways, and there are a whole host of barriers in overcoming those things. But we've got to, and I think we're trying to explore how we can continue to use our buildings more effectively, whether that's over the full year, including greater summer usage, whether that's over a longer period of the day, more weekend use, etc. And that's not just for educational space, it's for research space and clinical, which becomes a little bit more complicated. And then the last thing, and not to disagree with distinguished former Chancellor Matthews, but debt financing for us we see as an advantage. When we can issue debt, and our last thing at 3.25% over 20 years, I would argue it, in fact, does not extend the cost of the projects, and in fact creates greater opportunities for us to leverage. And again, I recognize that we are different, and the capital that we have and have access to is somewhat different, but there is a lot of work to do, but I guess it's probably not a question, but the utilization area is probably the area where we will focus a lot on.
Scott, you actually brought up the follow-up I was going to ask, and this I'm going to just pose this to think about. I don't have to address it right now, but can our institutions afford, the range was 1.5% to 2.5% for deferred maintenance, but it would require the matching concept that the work group you served on and that the coordinating board has reviewed twice in the last 3 years was a 50-50 match. Can our institutions afford, give or take, 0.25% to set aside 1% for deferred maintenance? So I just posed that to think about, maybe talk about in our work groups. Mike?
Thank you. The one thing that we found going around, I got all these 11 different universities, and Dr. Matthews and I have spoken frequently about, I kind of got laughed at the first time when I said we have too many systems. I still tell you that we've got too many systems. Part of it's what Scott's talking about, the ability to borrow money. I can name some of my university. I'll use Kingsville. Kingsville went years and years without building new facilities, without building dorms, without, I won't even call it deferred maintenance, without doing things that needed to be done to run a university because they were afraid to borrow the money. They borrowed the money. They were able to borrow the money because as a group of 11 universities, we've got better bond ratings. We can borrow more money, and there's backup. The universities pay the money back. I mean, there's not a default. There's not a problem with that. But by being closely associated with the system is part of what, I mean, we've talked about this before. This is what Guy was talking about.
You let me make everybody mad. The first 2 sessions I was chancellor, and then he took the role, and I got he didn't start using the same speech. Neither one of us made any progress.
No, I mean, but just because it doesn't get done doesn't mean it's not right. That's the first thing. The other thing, I think you have to make sure that the buildings are based on an academic master plan. Now, I'm convinced we can build buildings, but we build buildings and then figure out what it is we're going to teach or what we're going to do in the buildings, and that's backwards. It's absolutely backwards. You should determine and it's going to have to be flexible. We build flexible research space now. I mean, that's easy to do. You can build a warehouse and you can make it look like, I mean, it can be a top-notch lab. I don't know what they're going to be doing in 40 years. I don't know what kind of research it's going to be. I don't know what the facilities are going to look like. But I do know that I can build them flexible where if this is not what they want, we can clean it out and put in whatever it is they want. That's one of the things I think that you have to require. And then I would say words do make a difference. Deferred maintenance, that implies that we're not doing our job. It implies that we're not doing something we're supposed to be doing. We spend a whole bunch of money on undeferred maintenance. We do a lot of things. We fix a bunch of things. And, there's got to be some understanding that 0.5%, we spend much more than 0.5% on maintaining buildings and painting them and fixing the roofs and doing all these things. I prefer to call it campus renewal. And that's, A&M, the university, really, we have a $1 billion, so you got to set some priorities. And we've got to come up with a different word. It does make a difference. When we talk about deferred maintenance, it immediately casts aspersions at the people who are responsible for the day-to-day maintenance of the universities, and that's not fair. The other word that matters is tuition revenue bonds. For heaven's sake, define another word. It's unbelievable the amount of time I spend talking to parents and explaining to them that the things that we financed with tuition revenue bonds did not make your tuition go up. And I'm so, I don't even care what they call it, but call it something else. That really has to change. I don't think you'll find a single person in all of state government outside the legislature who thinks that that's a good way of doing it. But anyway, I do think that has to be changed. And I also think that we might consider having the state auditor's office, well, campus renewal. That one thing that makes a big difference, that we didn't intend to make a difference, and that's where deferred maintenance actually might be the right thing. The economy, the striving to close the gaps. We had plans. We had plans on, we would take this building down and we'll build this next building. In Laredo, we're growing at 10% per year. System-wide, our enrollment, our hours are growing 5.5%, almost 6% per year. I built the new building. I can't afford to take down the old building that I didn't do the maintenance on, because now I have to use it for teaching and for labs and for education. I've got faculty offices in places that I would not put people of such stature normally. So that the growth, our approaching the need to educate more kids, more students, and to have more faculty has caused us to continue to use buildings that we did not intend to continue to use. And so, we may be at cross purposes when we talk about growing and deferred maintenance and lowering budgets and continued Texas weather. I mean, I don't know how you...
We have just gone 4 minutes into the next speaker.
Well, I think what we just experienced was a panel of about a dozen members who teed up the challenge we've got very well. We've got limited resources. Our institutions are property rich and cash flow poor, and our next two panelists are going to help us come up with some new ideas on how to solve that. And Harvey, I know you had a comment, but since you're the next panelist, you can incorporate that. Harvey Kaiser is president and founder of Harvey H. Kaiser Associates and had a 25-year career with Syracuse University, managing and overseeing their facilities. And Harvey, we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, good. Thank you. Thank you. I'm really pleased to be here. When Mary Smith invited me to talk about capital budgeting and funding for facilities, I had to smile a little bit, because it's that issue's been my focus for about the last 25 or 30 years. And about 5 years ago, it became so troubling that I joined with a colleague, Eva Klein, to start to research it. And the research produced a book. And the coincidence is that when Mary invited me, the book was being printed. And it actually arrived yesterday by UPS. And the title is called Strategic Capital Development, which is about capital budgeting and funding for facilities. So I'm not going to talk about the book. I'll talk about the general background.
Do we all get signed, autographed copies?
They're still printing them. This was a proof copy, by the way, and I'm kind of a thrill to get it as I was dropping the lid on the car trunk to drive to the airport yesterday. If you've ever been through that kind of a trip. Just one point about deferred maintenance. I've really worked a lot and written an awful lot about that over the years. Semantics are the biggest problem. The problems in Texas are as big as the state. You talk about billions of dollars, but the issue there is that it's capital renewal mixed with backlog, and that the backlog has to be funded almost on an urgent basis, but could take 5 to 8 years to take care of. That's separate from the capital renewal. The ongoing repairs and renovations that require about 2 to 3% of the current replacement value is separate from the backlog, and there's a great misunderstanding that percentage will take care of the current backlog. They are separate and apart. So good luck at your $1 billion worth of needs, but you really have to clarify that they're two separate issues. The other part, which I'll be talking about, is that a good deal of the solution for this comes into rolling the future renewal into repair, renovation, upgrade, modernization projects. And there are some fine examples that I've worked on and I can recite. But I looked at the agenda, not just talking about a book, but the issues in Texas as they are nationally are how to fund the space capacity needs for both today and for the projected enrollment. What do you need for 500,000 students under your 2015 program? And secondly, how do you fund the reinvestment in facilities, which is the capital renewal issue? Not sure I could do this. And
Peter's an expert.
You're the IT guy. How do you do it?
I think it's that.
One on the right.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk to the screen because you have a handout, but let's take a global view of higher education nationally. Texas is similar with the whole spectrum of higher education in the United States, including the 1,400 or so public institutions. There are massive growth expectations. There's a need for research and renovation. There are relentless renewal needs, including the backlog, and so on, right down into the perpetual deficit of capital. Let me just illustrate a couple of points. One is the notion of how much money is being spent and where it's being spent. Nationally, the numbers based upon what survey are between $16 and $18 billion a year is spent on capital construction. About 70% of that is on new construction, when in fact it should be reversed in proportion for capital renewal versus new construction. But as someone cited, it's much more glamorous to break ground and have a ribbon cutting than fixing a leaking roof. I'll just set that one point aside. The other interesting point, and this gets to Scott's point, that the massive increase in debt across the board, primarily general obligation bonds is the term. I'm totally unfamiliar with the TRB and the tuition shell game, GO and...
You sound like you're familiar with it.
You got the basic principle anyway.
The full faith and credit of the state behind general obligation bonds is what the capital, or rather the private market, is pursuing. And you can see the phenomenal increase. This came out of J.P. Morgan's think tank. It drops off right at the very end, but that's only because it's the first quarter of the year. It has soared in the last 30 years. We're talking about issues going from 100 up to 800, values approaching $1 trillion in a year. So debt capacity, particularly at the current interest rates, are very, very attractive and seen as a solution for a variety of institutions. After looking at nationally what works and what doesn't work, we saw some extremely good examples where institutions and public systems had sought money, got money, taken care of the buildings for upwards of the last 25 to 30 years in both the public and private sector. We distilled it down to about 6 operating principles. And they're kind of lofty goals that might not resonate with the legislator, but amazingly they have in a few jurisdictions and institutions where it's been successful. The first principle is that you must link the capital needs with strategic principles. What do you think? I know I'm preaching to some of the choir here, but aligning what you want to do as an institution to the year 2015 with capital needs has some appeal to legislators or to the private sector governing boards. Secondly, this is an institution-wide responsibility. It's not just the chancellor, it's not just the chief facilities officer, but it's the governing board, it's the entire university community that has to realize that and it really waxes very lofty, that you have in trust those facilities built over the last century, and you're passing them on to the next generation. And there's appeal, amazingly, it has appeal to legislators and public to talk about a trustee responsibility. Third, you must have comprehensive needs assessment. A one-off study of deferred maintenance is inadequate to persuade anyone about what the real needs are. They must look comprehensively, and I'll touch on what some of those are. The point is that what you present as requirements, 5 years, 10 years, or whatever, must have credibility. You must pass the scrutiny of the most knowledgeable, the most zealous legislator, the governor. In Massachusetts, a new governor arrived, had it dropped on his desk, $1.2 billion worth of needs and a general obligation bond requirement. And after spending a couple of weeks reading the thing at his Nantucket house, he came back and said, I'll go for it, I'll push it through the legislature because the numbers are credible, the process that will arrive at those numbers are credible, and it was a transparent process. So that, and I've seen over and over again, a proposal to a legislature has crumbled because there wasn't a credible presentation of the data. Fifth, that there should be accountability. Amazingly, the question of having asked for and received the money had no response to the legislature. It has embittered both governors and legislators about the accountability. It's true in the military, it's true in K through 12, but higher education has a very poor history of showing what the money did in terms of either improving the academic offerings, the research dollars, and so on. And then the last point is considering the tenure of the leadership in higher education, the 7-year average of a chief executive officer, there really has to be built into the process continuity. That is, being passed from one president to another. We dealt with one president who after 13 years was leaving, but she didn't want to leave the institution adrift, commissioned a study comprehensively of all the facilities needs and passed that on to her successor, who in fact adopted those recommendations. So the continuity is significant to see. So just taking those 6 principles, and this gets to be one of those wild roadmaps that show up in a PowerPoint, but the notion that a process systematically could take 9 months to a year and a quarter, but moves through a series of steps that incorporates the community, identifies the needs, and then focuses on the ultimate point, which is a strategic funding framework. And I'll just move through these very quickly. The slides that follow, and you have them in print, but maybe we'll go through them one by one. I'll do them rather quickly. The notion that you should organize the process seems kind of ordinary and mundane, but in fact, it's this helter-skelter notion that the president didn't know about it, the chair of the governing board didn't know about it, the faculty didn't know about it, has caused the collapse of a very well-founded proposal. So organizing who does what, and most importantly, what the communication strategy is. From the first day, what the information is. You're going to reveal to the board maybe $1.5 billion worth of projects for a large, complex institution. How are you going to break the news? How are the faculty going to receive that? What kind of constituencies are you developing? So part of this new model that we looked at had this organizing element in the very beginning. The next element is to do a strategic review. Not a strategic plan, but to take a look at what the plan is, hopefully one's in place, and how you can extrapolate that anything to do with facilities. You can grasp a half a million students, generate 150 gross square feet per student at $350 a piece, and blink. Some math whiz could run those numbers and tell you're talking about trillions of dollars over 10 years for that added capacity, let alone what the current capacity shortfall is. But the strategic view takes a look at where you're going to grow, who's going to grow, what the needs are, and particularly with as diverse a structure as the state of Texas from south border to north. Without that strategic review at this board level, again, you're into contentious arguments between systems, and legislators would easily walk away from that kind of a difference of opinion. The next step, which is the credibility aspect, is that you have to collect data. bona fide, legitimate data that could withstand the scrutiny of a legislator who's a PhD to someone who came out of another environment. How did you get the numbers of $10 billion? Did you take a look at space capacity? That is, how many bottoms you're going to try and provide? How well do you utilize the space? How well do you use distance education? After you looked at the space capacity, you have to look at the quality of the existing facilities. Are they in a physical condition and functional condition? I don't want to get too immersed in that at one point, but it was working in Kansas maybe about 10 years ago. We found that while the deferred maintenance had been looked at, there was a problem of not having looked comprehensively at what the needs of the facilities were. That is, a renovation project was much more important than just looking at backlog. So you assess the quality of the facilities by looking at the physical condition and how well they work. And you really come up with numbers. What kind of projects emerge? Well, you put all this together in a list of projects. We did this in North Carolina 10 years ago. North Carolina is a state that looks at a knowledge economy. A bunch of competing institutions got together about 25 years ago and said, you know, we've got kind of a backwards economy. Our K through 12 isn't that strong. If we're going to survive, we've got to educate a workforce. And they set aside all the competing interests and created Triangle Research Park, which is fairly successful, a national model. And what they discovered was that as long as they joined forces and really linked arms to the legislature, they could mount significant campaigns. The last one was a bond issue of $3.1 billion, $2.5 billion actually, for the 16 universities. The legislature balked at voting for it, thinking, well, we'd better let the community vote on this. And where I'm from, when the community can vote on a referendum for a new school, they'll vote it down just to express their ire at taxation. 73% of the people in North Carolina said, facilities funding is a good idea. We'll tax ourselves, or we'll set up revenues to refund $2.5 billion for capacity and taking care of existing facilities. And again, I've seen that in several places we've worked. But the notion is that you have a plan of all the institutions prioritized. I also did this in New York State, where the governor decided $2 billion was something he had to toss at the faculty who were kind of irate at him. But the institutions had to decide what the priorities were so that the legislature could recognize this is all you're going to ask for. No one's going to come around and try and get some pork for a new stadium or something. And it worked, actually. Well, with a complete list and a bunch of priorities, you really start to look at this kind of a collection of data. But you've looked at now the space capacity issue. What do you have to provide for bottoms in the next 10 years? What kind of conditions are you trying to resolve? What kind of special needs do you might have that were unanticipated, whether it was a stadium or a research facility? And then finally, the infrastructure, which, by the way, if you haven't looked at that in your deferred maintenance, means you have a shortfall of about 25% in your deferred maintenance backlog. The infrastructure will torpedo you if you have not included it. And I think you have in UT and A&M. But other institutions have had to come back to the legislature and said, well, we thought it was about $500 million, but we're really off by 20 to 25% because we forgot the infrastructure. Well, then, this means that you now have a consolidated package. All the institutions have come on board. You've looked at what the needs are. You've prioritized so that an institution will concede its chemistry building is not more important than that one because they just have an antiquated facility, haven't built one, or whatever the needs are. So then you take a look at the funding plan, and this is, I think, where Cecil will help quite a bit. You want to take a look at how you funded in the past, which Texas has done an awful lot of. The recent President University Chancellor's document, 2006, took a look nationally what's been done. You take a look at what the current funding sources are, and you look at different funding scenarios. And with that, you come up with a funding plan. North Carolina originally had about a $7 billion set of needs. By a lot of triaging with the legislature, finally the legislature said, I think $2.5 billion will fly. What can you do for that? Which wasn't the most rational considering all the work you'd done. But anyway, what occurred was that, look, the private sector could take about a third of this. We can generate revenues for about another third of what these needs are. Now, where's the flex? What will the taxpayers be able to endorse? And again, because of the rich and poor institutions, those that had endowments, those that had struggled but could barely meet operating revenues, the state differentiated between how much each should share. And it was a lot of reasons how that was finally determined. So you then came up with a funding framework. Once you triaged this kind of funding, which, by the way, the University of Connecticut did when it acknowledged that it was at the bottom tier of public institutions quality. It was going to strive for the top tier in increments, whatever that meant. $2 billion was proposed for general obligation bonds in the year 2000, and again, it was about that ratio of one-third, one-third, one-third. One-third would come from the private sector. Another third were contributions, gifts, grants, federal funds. Another third would come from revenues, because they looked comprehensively at not only academic and research, but all the revenue-generating facilities, because this was all part of the total drain of resources on the institution. And again, with the triaging effect, they could present to the legislature not just a capital budget, which has been the curse of many campus master plans. A full bill wasn't presented, but also legislators and private institutional governing boards could see what the opportunities were for other funding sources. Other funding streams existed. And I think we've already seen some of them mentioned, but some of those supplementary sources, luckily I prepared this before hearing some of the points and seeing the other slides, but distance education and online learning has matured into a legitimate force. I would say up to maybe 10 years ago, 7, 6, distance education was only teaching that increment of students who could not make it to the physical space, be on the campus location. So it was looking at a marginal group of students who were the underserved population. Today, institution after institution, I know I was offering master's degrees without any residence at all on campus, and I'm sure that's occurring in Texas. Dazzle at the school I'm working at doing the comprehensive master plan, interviewing a group of students who signed up for a master's program, came to live in student housing, and really don't bother going to lectures because all the material's on board, and they can not have a drain on the classroom and that kind of situation. Space utilization, I know that the Texas model has been a national leader led by the coordinating board. The real point is, while numbers are reported, factually what occurs out in the field. How effective is utilization? How many hours a week it's used? I've been working in the Hong Kong universities for about the last 10 years, and there are 8 universities in some pretty pricey real estate. And their teaching is a 12-hour day, including Saturdays. 40, 50 students jammed together. You'll see the library lights on 24 hours a day, because for them, they're the driver for space utilization is the cost of real estate and building. Here we're a little more lavish, but it truly is atrocious. Just having walked through one campus, I call most afternoons facilities are usable as archery ranges, because you could, well, I don't have to say much more about that. And then, which we'll hear quite a bit about on energy performance contracting and third-party partnerships. So the answer on the capital budgeting aspect, after having looked through this comprehensive model, is that you now have a strategic base for looking at how much you need and where the funds can come from. Options vary. legislatively and so on. I'll just give one example from Syracuse University. About 20 years ago, a young man arrived at the chief financial officer's office, and a couple of us working with him heard a proposition that this individual would buy the steam plant, chiller plant, that fed about 12 million gross square feet of space. He would buy it, he'd offset the university's capital expenses for boilers, which was substantial. He'd operate the plant. He'd buy 20 years natural gas in Canada, pipe it into upstate New York, and he was doing this all because he had a cogeneration plan that he could sell off the excess energy to. That took maybe $50 million off the books immediately for the capital project of the boilers and all the related infrastructure, and lowered the cost of steam from $12 a thousand to $4 a thousand. So, having worked through that, it took about a year and a half, and some special state legislation. So there are really some fine examples out there of these models, or actually what went into this model that we talked about. I'm sorry. This is just a matrix of funding where 50% was state, about a third was fee supported, and 13% bypassed that. The implementation was the accountability aspect, but just related to this model, having applied it now over about the last 10 years, seen it emerge across the country and into Hong Kong, it's a viable approach that gains the attention of legislators, private governing boards, including governors, to realize that there is a credible and transparent process. And when asked to reflect upon how do you get the money, my first answer was there's no silver bullet, there's no magic wand, it ain't Kansas Dorothy, there are no ruby red slippers, but it's a lot of hard work, it's a lot of consensus building, and it's based upon a credible and transparent process. So that's my pitch on capital budget. So thank you.
Fred, I have a question. Fred, I have a question. Is this question answered, or are we going on?
We've got about 60 seconds before Cecil goes on.
Well, just on your process, are you speaking to each system independently, or are you basically saying in Texas that these 7 systems ought to come up with a strategy to present to the legislature as a unified strategy?
I don't want to be naive because I am familiar with the systems and the priorities, but I would say that with 7 systems, the legislature can play one off against the other, and I don't want to speak about higher levels of government than that, but I would say adamantly that the 7 should join together to present a uniform force. You're talking between $15 and $20 billion over the next 10 years. And I would think that the taxpayers, the legislators, have to be brought on board with those principles I talked about, and on a unified basis.
Thank you.
I think a coordinating board could be effective doing that.
Thanks, Harvey. Well, that's a good segue to Cecil Phillips, who's built a business around public-private partnerships and private development of university facilities as well as other markets. And then we will have a half hour of questions for both of these gentlemen at the conclusion of Cecil's remarks. So Cecil, we'll turn it over to you.
Fred, thank you very much. I want to say how grateful I am to be able to talk to so many influential and intelligent and sensitive men and women who know what they're about. I would like to put everything I think that I've heard today in some sort of context, which won't surprise any. And the context is this. The country is facing 2 simultaneous financing and credit crises. The one is the one we read about on the front page every day, and I think eventually we will work our way out of it. The system will rebalance itself. It won't be necessarily, in fact, it will not be the same as it was when we went into the recent unpleasantness after September the 15th, 2008, but it will right itself in a way that we would continue to recognize. The second financing and credit crisis, though, is more pernicious, and it's the one that underlays everything that's been said today. And that is the crisis that exists between post-secondary public education in Texas and in the country, and its relationship with its traditional sources of finance, the taxpayers, the public purse. I was fortunate enough to be the executive assistant to the governor of Georgia for 4 years in the 80s. And a couple of years ago, I went back and reviewed the budgets that we wrote for those 4 years. And as recently as the mid-'80s, the taxpayers of Georgia supplied 85% of the operating and capital requirements for the entire system. Today, it's under 30%. In many states, California, Michigan, and Virginia, it's under 10 cents. So what's happened on our watch, and as bad as that is, even worse is the halcyon days of the favored position of post-secondary education are not coming back. We can just forget it. We're not getting back. We may slow the decline, but we're not coming back. And so what that means is that you all and the men and women who work with you are confronted with a permanent, and I think, a present rather, and a permanent underfunded public mandate. Every school in the 7 systems of this state are going to continue to be public universities. Not a single one of them is going to be allowed to be privatized. That doesn't mean, however, that the taxpayers of Texas, just like the taxpayers of any other state, are going voluntarily to agree to increase their taxes to help support that underfunded public mandate. They are not. The fastest growing items in every state budget today is Medicaid. The big elephant in the room for about 48 out of 50 states is the underfunded pension and post-retirement health plans of those states. And when that word gets out to the voters, all of whom will vote as a block, I promise you, the retired teachers, the retired state employees who see either their pension or their health benefits at risk if those programs are not adequately and actuarially sound, is going to be to vote against anybody who is not in favor of making those funds actuarially sound. And in many states, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars. And when it comes time to sit around the budget writing table, those line items are going to have sharper elbows than just about anybody around the table, including higher education, to get their share of the public purse. That means we've got a dilemma. We've got an obligation to continue to educate Texas and every other state's emerging college students. Texas is both blessed and burdened by the fact that over the next 20 years, more men and women will come of 18 years of age than any other state in the country except California. They will be demographically diverse. As was said, many of them will come from lower socioeconomic groups than has been the tradition. Nevertheless, they are going to require and deserve a quality public education. How does that get funded? Well, what's going on in Texas and every other state that I know anything about is that just as in the private sector, the men and women who run these institutions are beginning to look at their capital as the precious resource that it is and say, look, I don't have enough of it to fund all of my obligations. What am I going to do with it? Well, before you can answer that question, you have to say, well, what is my mission? And my mission, not to speak for you, but to anticipate your answer is to educate these students the best way we can so that they can compete in the workforce, not just between Texas and Tennessee, but Texas and Tennessee and Taiwan and Thailand. And not a person in this room doesn't believe and know that those students in Taiwan, Thailand, and everywhere else outside this country know that for them, the way out and the way up is not through strong backs and weak wages. It's through getting a good education. And they will compete with us in a way that is unprecedented in world history. We've never had such job mobility, not by moving laborers from Michigan to Mississippi, but moving jobs from Texas to Taiwan or from California to Calcutta without moving the employees who used to do those jobs. So how can you compete in that world economy without a higher education? You can't. And therefore, since your mission is to educate these millions of emerging 18-year-olds with only 30% of the money that you had 15 years ago, you've got to say, all right, I've got to husband that precious capital to focus on my mission, which means teachers, classrooms, libraries, and laboratories. The kids have always had to eat somewhere. And when I went to college, we just ate in the dorms. We threw most of it away because mystery meat was just that, mystery meat, and we didn't eat it. But beginning in the early 90s, folks in your position and otherwise began to realize, well, look, just because the kids have to eat somewhere doesn't mean that we have to feed them. That's not part of our core mission of educating them. So let's find somebody whose business mission it is to feed students, to feed them. And so what was an expense item became a source of dividend or royalty payments. And you privatize that food delivery service to Marriott and Aramark and Morrison's and the normal suspects, and they started paying you a royalty to have access to tens of thousands of 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week human goats who would actually eat what was served to them because Marriott and those others knew what their customers wanted to eat. The next sort of transformation was in bookselling. The bookstores were all, where I went to school anyway, you went downstairs to the bottom of the student union and kind of got down on your hands and knees to find the book, and you went outside to the cash register and paid it. Somebody again realized, well, wait a minute, the kids have to have the books, but we don't have to be their merchandisers. Let us turn that function over to somebody whose business purpose it is to sell books. And so Barnes & Noble and Fawcett and Borders began to be effective competitors in that space to become the merchandisers, not only for the textbooks, but for everything else that those customers wanted. And today, on your campuses and others, when you go into a Barnes & Noble or Borders bookstore, it's merchandising 101. To get to the textbooks, you got to go past the T-shirts, the sweatshirts, the banners, and the license plates, and the bestsellers twice. Once to get to the textbooks, and once again to come out. It's the same thing at a grocery store. To get milk, the milk is at the back of the store. And you got to pass all the potato chips and everything else to get to the milk and come back, because the grocery store operator knows that milk is a fundamental grocery item, and they want to tempt you to buy as many other things besides milk as possible. Same way with books. I think the third facet of husbanding this public capital was in my business, in on-campus housing. We've been doing off-campus student housing for 20 years. But in 1995, we did the first in the country purely privatized on-campus housing. That is, there was no state lease, there was a subordinated ground lease, but there was no state lease of the finished units, there was no state guarantee, there was no state money, there was no state nothing. If this project got into trouble, the only people that you could blame if you had helped finance it was the person you saw brushing your teeth in the morning. You couldn't go to the governor or the speaker or the chairman of the appropriations committee and say, hey, will you bail me out? This was purely project financing. That model now has been used all over the country. I think increasingly, because if I'm right, and I think I am, about this permanent underfunding of public resources, that's both liberating and a challenge. It's liberating this way, because if you know what no longer works, you're free to ignore it. I don't think a single person here under even mild cross-examination is going to admit that even as a state as wealthy as Texas, that you're going to go back to the halcyon days, as I said before, of getting 50 to 60% of all the money you need from the legislature. It's not going to happen. I don't know. I'm not Nostradamus. I don't know what the impact in Texas is going to be of health care reform, whether it's this bill or another one, but I promise you much of that burden is going to be passed down to the states in the form of mandates that the federal government is going to require the states to fund. And once again, the folks who are writing budgets are going to be paying more attention to that sector of the demographics than they are to you or to me or the parents of the students who want to send their kids to these public schools. So the prospect of getting any more money from the state, I think, is not a favorable one. That's the liberating part. The challenge is that we've never had a model of privatizing post-secondary public education before. And most people, even entrepreneurs, but certainly administrators and overseers and educators, don't like to be pioneers because the fear of failure or the fear of making a mistake is so great. No one wants to try something new, have it not work, and then be blamed for it on his watch. That is a tension that's unavoidable. And it's a tension that's going to have to be overcome because there is no alternative. We're not going back to the good old days, and doing nothing means that nothing gets done. I am very optimistic, frankly, that this private capital solution that we're going to talk some more about can be done in post-secondary education. I'll give you an example in a somewhat different sector, but the same problem. I've been chairman of the Atlanta Housing Authority for 11 years. I've been on the board since 1993. In the late 80s and early 90s, this country made up its mind that it was no longer going to subsidize public housing for the working poor. And it didn't matter who was president, who was Speaker of the House, it didn't matter. Every year, that part of the HUD budget was cut anywhere from 6 to 15%. However, Congress didn't amend the 1934 Housing Act to say, okay, now that we're not supporting it with public money, you don't have to provide housing for the working poor. We still have to do it. And we knew we didn't have the ability to do it the old-fashioned way because we'd been to Congress so many times and they said, what part of no don't you understand? It's not coming back. Figure out a way to do it. And of course, who would take the hit if we didn't provide safe and secure public housing for the working poor? It's not the congressman from Montana who was telling me, forget it, guy. It was me. Because those 25,000 families living with me didn't know the congressman from Montana. And if I tried to, blabber about it was not my fault, it's his, they're going to say, what are you talking about? You're the guy running the housing authority, you solve the problem. So what we did was realize, A, the old ways weren't coming back, and therefore we were free to try new ways. And one of the first things that we realized as part of that new thinking was that the housing authority in Atlanta, and I will promise you every housing authority in the country, owns is some of the most valuable real estate in this nation. Because when we first did public housing, we put them in places that nobody ever thought, would really be that valuable. Well, cities grow up around them. In Atlanta, the first public housing project in the country was done out in a field that was close to a college called Georgia Tech. It still is called Georgia Tech. But nobody thought that it would ever be anything other than a suburb, if you will, of Atlanta. Well, by 1996, when the Olympics were coming to Atlanta, that field had become the world headquarters for Coca-Cola. Georgia Tech had surrounded it. CNN and TBS were right across the street. And all of a sudden, we had a 54-acre area of neighborhood blight that we knew was going to be on the front page of every newspaper, not only in America, but in the world. Because if Atlanta was selling itself as the next great city, well, what a hypocrite you are, because you've got 54 acres of the most dangerous neighborhood in Atlanta right there next to the Centennial Olympic Park. So we realized we had to do something. Doing nothing was not an alternative that was acceptable. So what we did is we realized, hey, 54 acres in the middle of downtown Atlanta, what can we do with that? Well, we were obliged as part of our mission to provide housing for the working poor. All right, how do we fulfill that mission without the traditional sources of support that we'd gotten from Congress? We said, well, let's start with the land. Because if I could tell a developer, and I am a developer, hey, here's 54 acres, we're going to put this in the deal, and we want you to build some housing that's going to turn out to be mixed income housing, which is exactly what's happened. What do you pay for that right? What will you contribute towards making that housing effective? Much like the same conversation that universities had with Marriott and Borders and people like me about what are you going to pay for access to all of these customers. And we had developers banging on our door saying, well, gosh, if you put the land in as a long-term 65-year unsubordinated ground lease, like a wedding cake, we can put some Hope 6 grants on top of that and some of our own equity, imagine that, and some construction financing, and pretty soon the numbers start working. And so they have. Flash forward to 14 years later, we have transformed 21 public housing communities, 25,000 units, into, and I will say this without fear of contradiction or being accused of false pride, the most successful renovation with private financing of public housing in the world. We've done a better job of it than anybody else on earth. and we have transformed what used to be pockets of poverty into vibrant neighborhoods of mixed-income neighbors really get along with each other. In the post-secondary space, there's another example, and we have to give examples because the model hasn't yet been worked out. And listening to Mr. Kelly from UT, one size doesn't fit all, folks. What's going to work at some institutions and some of the systems ain't going to work at the others. And you shouldn't try to pursue that holy grail because it isn't there. You're going to have to be sensitive to the differences within the universities and within the systems to accommodate how you attract private capital to remedy the infrastructure problems that are there and are only getting worse. I'll give you an example of something that also will work. The president of a school out west of here heard me make a speech and asked me to come to his office and said, look, I'm going to make my reputation on a new business school for this institution. It's going to cost $50 million, and I've raised 25. I don't have time because presidents only last about 7 years. Guy, I hope you last a lot longer, frankly, and you should. And I'm 3 years into my term. It's going to take me more than 4 years to raise another $25 million because we've just gone into the downturn. And he said, I'm going to leave here without actually having made much of a difference. As he said, I kind of wiped my hand through a pail of water and left no trace. And he said, I don't know how to do it. And I had done what I'm about to describe, a similar project in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where we financed a public elementary school with purely private money. And the example I gave him was this. Look, don't try wasting your time or spending your time gathering the other $25 million from the normal suspects. Take that $25 million and tell the lenders and equity investors like me, tell you what, I need $50 million to build my business school at today's costs and today's specs. And I want to borrow or have you invest the whole $50 million. And as collateral for that, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to put $25 million here on deposit, and I'm going to pay rent to you on the basis that comes out at some sort of return to pay the bank, the interest, and a return to my investors. And the rent's going to be driven by that return. And at the end of 20 years, guess what? I not only have my business school, I've got my $25 million. Whereas the old way was take the 25, add 25 to it, and at the end of 20 years, you've got the business school, but no money. It hasn't happened yet because he got lured away by another institution to do something else. The point I'm making by those anecdotes is that part of the freedom from losing the ties to the old ways is that you have available to you the sort of financial engineering that Rick Francis and I deal with every day in the private financial markets. You can create all sorts of campus-specific and project-specific financing tailored to your needs. And by tailoring to your needs, and this has been said many times, don't let the financing drive what you want. Let the purpose, your mission, drive what you want. And then have the financing conform to it, because the financing is adaptable enough that it can conform to it. It's not the old days of going and getting GO bonds or payback bonds, as we called your tuition revenue bonds in Georgia, and then you just spend it on that and that's it. There are a lot of things, including an asset that traditionally has been completely wasted on public campuses. Wasted in the context that it's valuable to the private sector. It's called depreciation. Public institutions can't use depreciation because they don't pay taxes. Well, the private sector does. And if you offer the private sector an opportunity to invest in part of the infrastructure, and that opportunity includes the opportunity to allocate the depreciation to that investor, well, that means that the return to that investor that you would otherwise have to pay is going to be reduced because of the benefit that that investor gets from the depreciation. So you are able to keep, whether it's talking about the rents that the kids pay or the rent that the institutions pay, it's marginally lower than it otherwise would be because you're taking advantage of an asset that's available in the private sector, depreciation, that isn't available in the public sector. Now, we've also talked a little bit about dormitories and other stuff. Another proposal I've made to 4 different schools, hasn't been accepted yet, but I'm from Missouri, so I'm real stubborn, I don't give up, is this. Another president wanted to make her mark as president to be one of the destination campuses for nanotechnology in this country. And she needed, as it turned out, there's something magic about $50 million, I guess, to do that. And she knew that she could not steal the intellectual talent from Caltech or Georgia Tech or MIT or Case Western to do nanotechnology with just a typical chemistry lab with a Bunsen burner and the beaker. You had to have state-of-the-art facilities. It wasn't a chicken or the egg. We know what comes first, and she did too. But there wasn't a chance of the perennial snowball of her getting $50 million for a nanotechnology center from this state legislature that was as hidebound as any. They didn't even know what nanotechnology meant and didn't want to know. So she said, you know, where do I get this $50 million? Because we don't have an alumni group of nanotechnologists who've done businesses so successful that they will reinvest in creating a better nanotech. I've got a bunch of, chemistry majors and alums from history majors and stuff like that. And I looked at her and I said, look, you've got 7,500 beds of dormitory beds on your campus. She had done a study about a year before from an outside consultant who told her that and this is what happens, if you don't repair, you have to renovate and you have to replace, because that, whether you call it deferred maintenance, deferred renewal, or whatever, it don't get any better unless you fix it. It's just like your car. And the report came back that to bring these 7,500 beds up to fire safety, because when these dorms were built, they were built in the 60s, and no code in America required high-rise residential to have sprinklers, and they would probably have been exempt from the local zoning ordinances anyway. So none of them was sprinklered, and none of them complied with the Americans with Disabilities Act, because the ADA wasn't passed until 1992. So she had almost $400 million of capital improvement that she needed to find to bring these 7,500 beds up to market legal acceptance. Because, as somebody said, these buildings aren't obsolete in terms of their structural integrity. They were built to last 100 years. But since none of us really is smart enough to know what the needs are going to be 100 years from now, why pay for 100 years when the likelihood is you're not going to get more than 40 or 50 years of it? You're burdening yourself and your successors with a cost that they're never going to be able to get a payback on. So anyway, it wasn't the structural integrity of these dorms. They were just culturally obsolete. They had the gang showers and everything down at the hall. Some of them weren't even air conditioned. The roofs leaked. Everything had to be replaced. And I said, look, I've done some numbers. And this is what I propose. I will sign my company and our investors will sign a long-term master lease, not sell, but a long-term master lease of those 7,500 dorm beds. And we will pay the lease payment on the front end. And that lease payment is going to be $450 million, because that's the cost that it's going to take to renovate and bring up to code these 7,500 beds. And I said, in addition, because I've done this in advance, I said, we can pay actually $500 million for the same opportunity to master lease these beds. And she said, well, why would you pay that much? And I said, well, because I'm going to ask for 10 more years on the master lease of the facility, and I might have a chance to build your nanotechnology center, because that $500 million includes $450 million for the dorms and $50 million for your nanotechnology center. And this is what really got her attention. Without a single appropriated dollar, she didn't have to go to the legislature for a single thing that I was proposing. And it's still true. She's still thinking about it. Her dilemma is, and I get asked this everywhere, well, see, so where else has this been done? Because nobody wants to be first. And I understand that. But somebody's going to have to be. And it's going to be finally somebody who two things happen. There's going to be a leader who says, I'm staking my reputation on it, and followers are saying, we're so desperate that if we don't do something new, nothing's going to get done. And pretty soon we're going to get blamed and criticized for doing nothing, and we're not going to be able to go have a press conference and whine about not being funded by the Texas or any other legislature, because that's what it's going to be seen as whining. We got to be adults and figure out a way to solve this problem. And what I'm here to tell you is that this problem has lots of solutions, almost all of which have not been tried yet, but there's enough experience with private capital doing what institutions used to do, from feeding kids to selling them books to housing them, that it's safe to go into that water, and you are going to be freed up to be creative with respect to forming and formulating policies for financing your particular infrastructure on your campus that is finely tuned to get you the infrastructure that you want at affordable rates. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Cecil. We've got 32 minutes for questions for both of these gentlemen, or for that matter, the previous panelists. So who'd like to go first?
Everybody wants to be first.
It's safe.
Raymond.
Cecil, I have a question. And I don't know if it's for you or if it's for some of the people who are on the academic side. So you do the dormitories. You take the revenue from the dormitories and you give the university a land lease. Does that land lease return the same amount of money or more to the university than the profit that they would make off of having their own dorm?
Well, to get the profit off their own dorm, they're going to have to bring it up to the standards that we would want to, because so they can charge the appropriate rents. The tension is, those dorms, even as bad as they are generating auxiliary income that is used in all sorts of ways that the presidents or the CFOs use. And that auxiliary income is going to be lost because it's going to have to go to pay, if you will, to pay us and the banks for upgrading the dorms. The magic, though, Ray, is that the ground lease has two components. One is just a fixed rate, and it's usually nominal, $1,000 a year. And then, as you negotiate the ground lease, you say, look, at the end of the day, my clients and I and any other investor is interested in maintaining our return. And we will negotiate a participating rent with the university that says if we do better than our budget, or if we reach a certain level within our budget, then that level of income above this particular line will be shared, say 50-50 or even 60-40 with the institution, so that our interests are aligned. The university wants us to do three things. Upgrade the dorms so that they're attractive and competitive, and you can attract kids to live on campus for pedagogical and other reasons. Second, they want to make sure that we don't, and we have no interest in doing this, in gouging the students by charging rents that are extortionate. And so you can be sure that the ground lease is going to have governors on our ability to do it. Why would we do it anyway? But even if we were inclined to do it, there are provisions in the ground lease that say, all right, every year the budget's going to be approved by the university, and it's going to, have the rent's going to be a reflection of what our return needs to be. And sometimes, if we put solar panels on the roof and we get a subsidy, if you will, from the power company, then that will keep our costs down, and we don't have to raise rents as much, because everybody wants the same thing. We want full occupancy at affordable rents that give us the return. So you're going to have to look at giving up the auxiliary income, but getting a product that you're not going to get otherwise to that satisfies the demand from the kids, and then the opportunity to participate in the success of that project. And you see, after the debt's paid off in about 28 years, then what happens is the money that used to go pay off the debt is now going to be shared between the owner, if you will, us, and the university in a way that's much more beneficial to the school.
and I assume the maintenance of that dorm hasn't been deferred.
No, exactly right. That's the other thing, because you see, as part of our budget, we do this without any encouragement. Every year, we have a repair and replacement reserve, and if we don't spend it, we roll it forward to the next year, because we don't want a repair cost to become a renovation cost to become a replacement cost. I've read that book. And so part of our budget, which is funded directly from the rent that we receive, includes not only paying the utilities, but also making sure that the repairs are made in real time. I'll give you another example of the way we do it. We manage, I think, 11 different campuses for on-campus housing. And even though Solomon didn't really end up splitting the baby, he gave us an example of how you might solve a problem by splitting the baby. And we split the baby this way. Getting back to the definition of core mission, my core mission, put crassly perhaps, is we're landlords. We know about renting and maintenance and stuff like that, but we're not as qualified as the institution for the living, learning aspects of on-campus housing. And folks have known for a good long while that dormitories are more than just about shelter, about putting heads on pillows. There is a community aspect and a living and a learning aspect that should not be forsaken, and it should not be outsourced to us. It should stay right where it belongs, with you. And that's why when we go in and we build new housing on campus or we renovate dorms, is the new floor plans have what we call breakout space for just that sort of living, learning, community building stuff where the university comes in and they have everything there from seminars to classrooms to seminars about drinking, date rape, the whole sorts of things that they're supposed to be doing with respect to these 18 and 19-year-old kids. We also, by the way, inspect every unit every month, and the reason we do that is obvious to everybody in this room. You know, if I'm unlucky in physics or my girlfriend dumps me and I come back and I take it out on the wall and nobody taps me on the shoulder, then the next time I'm unlucky in physics or love, you know, well, I guess that's okay because nobody said I couldn't. And remember, I'm 18 years old, so all of a sudden that first hole has a second one. And by the end of the second semester, I guess they're going to take my security deposit anyway, I say to myself, so let's make it a pegboard. And we just pound the living daylights out of it. And that's why so many schools have had to take offline, that euphemism, their dorms during the summer to repair all of that. We found that if you repair it in real time, two very good things happen. The kids pay for it in real time because we send them a bill for it. And second, they don't do it anymore because they realize that there is a real-time cost associated with being unlucky in physics or with girlfriends. And they don't do it. And so our repair and replacement budget isn't spent every year because we intervene in their lives and prevent them from doing it again.
Not that girls' daughters are perfect, but I know landlords in College Station who won't even lease to guys. They'll only lease to co-eds.
We have 3 projects in College Station, and we would get sued if we did that. But I will tell you, and this is another factor that you all are aware of as much as I am. For the first time ever in American history, 5 years ago, there were more girls. I have 3 daughters, so I'm all for this, I guess. There were more girls enrolled in America's colleges and universities than guys. Today, it's about 55%. Female to male. Now, that has all sorts of socio-political, economic ramifications that are beyond the responsibility of anybody in this room. But it's a reality that everybody's going to have to deal with, ranging from what sort of majors do we offer? Do we test Larry Summers' view about are women smart in math and science? I think they are, by the way. And what sort of programs do we offer in the living and learning, and how do we redesign our on-campus housing for them, you know? Kids today, somebody earlier said, I think it was Guy, you know, that unlike when I grew up, my brother and I shared my grandmother's bed until I went off to college. And so when I went off and had my own bunk bed in my dorm, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. Well, my children grew up just as he was saying. They didn't share a bedroom with anybody, and they had 3 daughters, they had 2 bathrooms. When they go off to college, they don't want to become monks or nuns and kind of step back into the cloister and say, oh yeah, I'd like to live in my dad's dorm or my grandmother's. They don't want to. They've got a worldview that reflects the fact that they're spoiled. That's just the word for it. And they want their own bedroom, they want their own bathroom, and mom and dad are willing to pay for it. And, where I went to school, you couldn't have a car until you were a senior. Well, as Guy was suggesting, if he's got 10,000 more freshmen coming to his institution over the next decade, that's not only 10,000 more beds that the market's going to have to provide, it's 10,000 more parking spaces. And if he has to go to the normal public sources to get, say they cost $15,000 a space, what is that, $150 million for parking? And that's going to be his legacy? I don't think so. There's got to be, and there is another way. What I'm saying is, there's got to be another way to meet that need. And it is a need. You can call it spoiled, whatever. The truth is, because, what'd you say, 80% of your undergraduates come from more than 6 hours away? They're bringing a car. They're not coming on the Greyhound bus. And they're going to bring that car, and they're going to need to park it somewhere. And since most of them can't live on, or don't live on campus, they're going to have parking on campus. And that's something he's going to have to provide, but that doesn't mean that it's something that he's got to finance with public money, because there's plenty of private money out there that will do it for him.
Mike?
I need to ask just some financial questions, because this whole financing seems to be built on the premise of not having the ability to finance it otherwise. Because we've been down the road a number of times where we do ground leases, we hire private people who are going to build it and run it. We get to have our policies in the dorm. We go way down and every single time it gets to the bottom, and that is we can borrow money cheaper than they can, and therefore the rent to the students is going to be cheaper. So we end up hiring this month to be the contractor, but we stay.
Michael, it's how you want, this is what I was talking about earlier, it's how you want to spend the money that's available to you. If you, I'm not casting aspersions, there's no wrong or right answer, there's different answers. If your institution would rather borrow money for dorms than for chemistry labs, that's your decision. There's undoubtedly a higher cost associated with privatized.
That's what I want to know. To the students, is the rent is higher, would be higher with the privatized dorm than it would be with the very same thing built with public money.
Right, but it's not as high as you might have. It's not as high as it otherwise would be because of the depreciation aspect that I talked to you about.
And besides that, we're hiring people who know what they're doing.
Right.
Something to be said for that.
It's a function of, how are you going to allocate the capital that's available to you? The capital from the legislature and the capital that you can access through borrowing on your own. And it depends on how you define your mission. Some schools, they're all private schools, have said, and they're smaller schools, 5,000 students and below, they have said that on-campus housing is as important to our mission as on-campus physics lab. And we're going to finance them the same way. It's their money, it's their college, it's their decision. Public schools that I talk to, if they have a choice between asking for $50 million from the governor or the public markets for a physics lab or $50 million for a dormitory, 9 out of 10 are going to ask for the physics lab because that's consistent with their mission.
Charles, did you have? I'm sorry.
There's a factor of debt capacity and really where you want the money to go. And you'll have to examine what your capacity is and whether you have capacity for both and only for the housing. So I think that's significant, particularly at the smaller, less elite private schools that don't have a high rating as the large universities.
I had a real-life experience doing this. When I got to the Texas State University system, we had 5 dorms on 3 campuses, had a debt of about something less than $150 million. First complaint I got was every time we want to build another dorm, we have to ask permission of the developer to do that because he's trying to protect his asset. We were being charged a fee for those. Then the other complaint was their policies and the way they manage their students in those dorms are different than the policies in the rest. Huge conflict with the presidents. That caused me to start looking at the cost. And these were built at a time when developers were selling these ideas as this is a way to finance these projects with the debt not being on your books. if you'd ever talked to Moody's and Standard & Poor's, you knew, of course, that was not correct. It was the Enron approach, and boards were sold in doing that because, well, that debt didn't show up, and, it gave you more debt capacity. So I then began looking at it. I had an extensive experience and background in finance, and when I knew I was in trouble is when I looked at what they were paying for bond insurance. When I do a bond issue, back in the days when we used bond insurance, I'll get a competitive bid of about 17 basis points. They were paying 125 basis points. So I knew right away that we had a deal that wasn't all that good. I talk longer than you got time to talk about all the things wrong with that deal. We refinanced it. I was written up by Moody's across the country as the one system that had figured out how to do this. Some of the rents were dropped as much as $1,800 a semester per room. We took some of the escrow money that had been set aside because they were so nervous about this debt because nobody was guaranteeing it, but the revenues from the kids, and we took another $10 million. When I got done, I pulled out of that transaction 22% of the capital and reduced rents in all of those dorms. I mean, my board and my campuses thought, we've done something pretty special. The rent for the investor was just too high.
And you've got to run those numbers from the beginning, Charles.
Absolutely.
And you see, what happens is the bond insurance is a broken model. There's only one bond insurer.
You don't do that anymore.
You don't do that anymore. And so that historical example is accurate, but it's not accurate going forward. I made a speech last week in New York with Moody's because they've changed the rules about something being off credit, and they don't have that obligation or that characterization anymore. What Moody's looks at in this privatized structure that I'm talking about is who incurs the first loss. Let me give you an example. If the university master lease, say we build it and the university master leases it, then there's no doubt in anybody's mind that if there's a loss because it fails to perform, the university's got this lease payment that it's got to pay part of the debt. So the first loss is with the university, and therefore, even though it's non-recourse debt, and it is off the balance sheet of the university, there's going to be what they call a shadow rating, so that some of that debt is going to be considered part of the credit capacity of the university, because the university has the first loss. However, in the structure that I'm talking about, the first loss isn't with the university, it's guess who? The equity investor. Because unlike the bond financings, these aren't 100% debt finance. Clients, equity investors actually put in real money. They don't get the depreciation if they don't. They got to put in real money, their own money. I'm making these numbers up, but say it's a $100 million project. The banks are going to require us to put in at least $20 million of first loss money before they'll lend $80 million. And they're going to require us to guarantee the debt. Even though we're on campus pursuant to an unsubordinated ground lease, Moody's is going to say, okay, this debt it's not on the foundation's balance sheet because we're not a foundation. There's no affiliation otherwise between us and the university. The first loss is going to be the equity guys, because we can make the rational economic decision that if there's a $200,000 check that's got to be written one year because of an operating loss, the equity investors, to protect that $20 million, are more likely to write that $200,000 check than the university. And therefore, as long as that first risk is borne by the outside private equity investors, the impact on the credit of the university is much less, because the university is not likely to have to come to the rescue of that project if it gets in trouble. That's part of the financial engineering, the liberty, the freedom to start saying, okay, we want you guys to have skin in the game. If you think so much of this opportunity to house our students, put your money where your mouth is. Write a check that is sufficient to attract conventional capital to finance it. And then you can do it. And I'm attracted to it for the same reason that I told you that Barnes & Noble and Marriott are attracted to it. I've got great location, the land on campus, just like with my housing authority and the point that Guy Bailey made, and I've got reliable numbers of customers, because you want them to live on campus as much as I do. Our interests are aligned. And the third thing is, I believe in that so much that I'm going to write a check to support that belief.
David, go ahead.
I realize there's a difference between tuition at a private university and a public university. But is there anything we can learn from private universities in terms of how they're funding the same issues that you're faced with as a state university, in terms of are they doing private-public partnerships? Or are they, I mean, obviously the tuition gap's not making up all the difference.
No, it's not. You've got to divide the private universities, just like Caesar said Gaul was divided into three parts. You've got the private universities that everybody knows about, Duke, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Notre Dame, and the rest of them, that have endowments, legacies, and alumni support that will get them through the most difficult times, even if they lose 25% of the value of their endowment, like Harvard and Yale did. They finance things very differently than the smaller, particularly the middle-level private schools who don't have endowments in the hundreds of millions of dollars to get them through the difficult times, and they are tuition impacted. I haven't checked lately, but I think tuition at Harvard next year is going to be like $45,000. 50? Okay, and you know, Harvard is saying that, okay, if you get into Harvard, don't worry about the financing, we'll pay for it. Well, that gives Harvard a competitive advantage for somebody, you know, going to Harvard or Lawrence College in Wisconsin that may not be overcomable. But Harvard and Yale, and those are the exceptions that prove the rule about how difficult private middle secular schools, and even more, the private religious affiliated schools are having. The truth is that there is going to be a significantly fewer number of private and religious affiliated schools 5 years from now than there are today. It's not a model that you should try to emulate. There are very few things that the private schools are doing that I think are in the context that you and I are talking about, that are transferable to public schools. The one lesson to be learned is that they've never been able to go to the legislature or the governor for money.
Right.
So it can be done, and they do it on the backs of endowments and tuition. Some of you are blessed with higher endowments than others, but the truth is you've got to find a way to do it, and you can't raise tuitions beyond politically unacceptable levels, and your endowment may or may not be throwing off its proverbial 8% a year. And you've got to do something, because doing nothing means nothing gets done, and that's not an acceptable answer.
The only thing I would add to that is that the untapped private giving with either the smaller, less elite, middle, secular schools really was gaining traction up until 2008, where there had never been a campaign or just a minor gift was celebrated. Schools were finding donors with millions of dollars, surprises, until 2008. So there was a lesson, but unfortunately it's not sustained anymore.
Let me ask it. This is a question for both you gentlemen, and it's a three-part question. One is other new auxiliary sources of revenue that you're seeing around the country. Maybe as a particular example, we touched only briefly on working with ESCOs and energy performance contracts. We just approved one for UNT, where one of our large community colleges we learned this morning is working on such an agreement. Secondly, creative examples of monetizing other creative examples of monetizing non-auxiliary assets and or revenue streams. And particularly I'd like to hear some community college examples. And then thirdly, and maybe this is for you, Harvey, is best public alternatives to tuition revenue bonds, using examples of other states.
Well, I hate to return to that one point, but the conclusion was general obligation bonds is and has been and will be the only reliable source. Full faith and credit of the state behind it. With, of course, triaging for other gifts, grants, and any other way you can buttress that other than going to the legislature. The other questions, some of you may not have seen a University of Washington or a study commissioned by the state legislature in Washington following the 2006 Texas study. They looked at in great detail, I just refer to it, do a Google, University of Washington studies. Actually, I have a citation here somewhere to give you. But they took a look at other, there wasn't PUF or OFF or ETH, it was leasing timberlands. They looked at other state revenue sources they possibly can market. They looked at procurement. They looked at space utilization. They looked at what I call the third-party relationships very intensively. And they came away with some significant conclusions about each of those, and I had that slide on it. But they did find, for example, that utilization offset building classroom space. Remember, utilization deals with just classroom and teaching lab, and that's maybe 10, 12% of the total pool of space. So you're really not cranking that much up, but you're still gaining benefits. So that was a whole basket of activities which the state of Washington was actually state legislation mandated this study, and they really exhaustively looked at also, I think, design, could a standardized design or some other methods of procuring facilities had any benefit. So I just cite that as a reference.
But that's the reason we looked at the rainy day fund as a source of revenue, because that's where the governor's enterprise money comes from. And so we thought maybe that was a source of revenue that the legislature might be interested in dedicating to higher education. It was the only fund I could find in the budget that was there, but not everybody was capturing.
But with tuition revenue bonds, the debt raters look at the debt, look at the institution rather than the
Yeah, but here's the problem, and I did make my point very well, and I misinformed Scott a little bit. The reason that I suggested that we have the universities do pay cash rather than interest is there's an enormous. The reason that the legislature is not in favor of TRBs is not because they're bad folks. It's because Texas has lost its AAA bond rating, and we're now AA. University of Texas is AAA, but they're now AA. The amount of debt service that's built into the General Appropriation Act is about $350 million a year, I think it is. And so the rating agencies are beating us up. I mean, they're talking to the Legislative Budget Board and everybody else saying, guys, you guys got to quit doing that. You're tying up at such a significant amount of GR with debt that you've got to stop that. And so that was the reason because I knew that was the only way I was going to be able to get a very conservative member to be in favor of it, to say we won't add any more debt. And I understand the leverage of the money, but it was that was the only thing that would possibly fly. But that I still think that rainy day fund is a conversation that should be had. I mean, Texas, Ernie Angelo is in the business. I mean, the Lord has blessed Texas like no one else with resources, and we thought we'd found most of it until we found the Barnett Shale, and we found out we hardly figured out what was there. And those revenues are just going to be there for Texas for a very long period of time. If you ever want to get optimistic, talk to the University of Texas Bureau of Economic Geology and listen to those guys talk about how long that revenue stream is going to be in place. You know, you're talking about 100 years, 150 years of production at the rate that we're doing today, according to some of the brightest people in the world on those issues.
Let me segue off that. So with debt capacity and debt ratings both under squeeze, regardless of whether it's general obligation bonds or TRBs.
It doesn't matter.
Let's flip it back to the first two parts of my question, which is new or creative auxiliary streams of revenue and or the monetizing of non-auxiliary assets. And in particular, if you can cite community college examples.
Do I think that? Sure.
What I'm about to suggest, I do not expect to occur in the lifetime of anybody in this room. okay? But maybe I'm just exaggerating the point in order to make it, but let me make it anyway. I see no policy or other reason for any university system to own, with a few exceptions, any of the buildings in which it conducts its educational mission. They got it. What's important is what goes on inside those buildings. No doubt about that. That's what they do. But connecting the dot between what goes on inside and owning the building is, to me, a false connection. And the reason I say this is back in 1989, I had done a lot of work as a lawyer negotiating with IBM, who had about as good as real estate department as there existed in the world, lawyers and otherwise. In 1989, IBM was on its knees. It was losing market share. It was getting clobbered. The days of big iron were clearly over. They had bet the company on that because that's how the company got started and made its fortune. And John Akers, who was the last lifer at IBM, as part of his last year, said, you know, I've got to look at this business inside and out and assume nothing, except that everything has to be reexamined. So he set up, I think it was 10 or 12 analysis groups that were going to look at every division of IBM, to look at their profitability, their relevance in the past, the present, and the future. And he did something very smart. He put the person in charge of each analysis group that was from a different division, so that whoever was looking at the $10 billion of IBM's real estate that it owned throughout the world, that analysis group was headed by somebody from microcomputing. Okay? Actually, in this example, which is true, it was headed up by a lawyer from the legal division. And they did all this, and in about 6 months, they came back with the following report. IBM owns about $10 billion of real estate throughout the world, ranging from the skunkworks secret stuff that it does for the United States government in Switzerland and America and its headquarters in Rye, to a whole bunch of office buildings that it owns, some of which it occupies completely and some of which it occupies in part. And then they did the next step and said, well, all right, what's our return on that $10 billion? What are IBM shareholders getting for that $10 billion of investment? And it turned out that on a generous analysis, they were getting right at $1 billion of return. So they're making a 10% return. Well, then the real question was asked, well, what are we getting in our computer business? What's the return there? It's 27% on our invested dollar. Well, you don't have to have a PhD in economics or anything to realize that there was a serious misallocation of $10 billion of IBM shareholders' capital that was only getting a 10% return, whereas if it were invested in the core business of IBM, it could make, under their analysis, 27%. So you know what IBM did? It sold 90% of its real estate to folks, pension funds and others, who would love to get an 8% return from IBM as a tenant, and they took that $9 billion and reinvested it in IBM's core business, so that the next CEO of IBM, and if you read his book, Elephants Can Dance, you'll see that he gives credit to Akers for freeing up that much capital to deploy, without going to the public markets, without diluting shareholders, without borrowing a dime, that $9 billion to reinvest. They made 27, and they gave 10% or 8% to the other people and kept the difference and continued to grow the business. In this example, and this is where I know it's a stretch, you could sell, not the whole campus, but certain buildings and say, all right, look, we're going to sell these for a return. And we're going to take that investment and put it into a new, I'm not stuck on nanotechnology, pick your specialty, that's going to be able to attract men and women who bring with them grant-getting ability. We're going to turn this laboratory that we're going to build from having sold these buildings on campus and now paying rent for, we're going to take that money and build this new facility that's going to attract these bright men and women from all over the world who are going to bring with them the opportunity and ability to bring tens of millions of dollars of grants from the federal, state, and international government. And we're going to make this new lab cash flow positive. And so in my example, you've done exactly what IBM did. You said, what's my core business? What should I be doing with my money? Where am I misallocating my money? How can I extract that misallocation and put it to a higher and better use that's consistent with my purpose and make a higher return on it? Now, I know, like I said at the beginning, that's not likely to happen in my lifetime, but it's not impossible. And the first two examples, they're outside higher education, and they were born of desperation instead of foresight. But California has sold and leased back 4 of its office buildings in Southern California that it occupies all of. Because California realized we got to have the offices to do the state's business, but we don't have to own the bricks and mortar. Let's take that money and do something else with it, balance our budget, and we'll pay rent to these people who want to get an 8% return, which is the same thing as buying a GO bond from California, only you're getting an 8% return instead of a 4.5%. Not all that bad. And almost next door to Texas, Arizona 3 months ago, they borrowed money against the state capitol building. Not because it generates any money like the California offices do, but because the lenders knew that it would be politically impossible for the state to default on a loan that was secured by the state capitol. Now, the lenders, it's like lending to a church. You're never going to foreclose on a church. You're never going to foreclose on the state capitol. That's not the point. The lawyers take a back seat. The politicians know that the embarrassment and shame and ridicule of having the state capitol foreclosed on the courthouse step ain't going to happen. So that debt was as secure as any other debt that Arizona could have issued. And so what I'm telling you is they didn't need even to own the state capitol. They needed a state capitol in which to do the state's business, but they realized that they didn't have to own the building in which to do the state's business. And I'm suggesting to you there may be an analogy here on a trial basis for some of you at least to consider that.
Rich? We've looked at this. Our chancellor's been very interested in looking at alternative revenue sources and these creative methods of financing. And the bottom line is, I think, unless you have debt capacity problems, is what was just talked about. The bottom line is it is more expensive because of the rate of interest we pay to borrow money than turn it over to a private sector. So I'd be interested, either now or offline, hearing some examples where that isn't true. If you don't have a debt capacity issue and you've got a good rating, how it really becomes cost effective. Because bottom line, people have gone back and run the numbers and come back and say, no, we can't offer. They've offered opportunities for quality. They said we can bring quality contractors and architects. Well, the folks they bring in are the same people we use, because you don't build a sophisticated chemistry building without having top-flight contractors, and you don't design it without having top-flight architects. So I think conceptually we've gone down that road many times, and we've never come up with a good project. So I'd be interested in any time of hearing where it really does, in fact, work. I just say a caution about the sale of campuses, that it opens up a whole tax issue, it opens up you to municipal zoning, it opens you up to a whole host of issues that regulatory processes that we currently don't deal with. We have enough regulatory processes to deal with.
I wouldn't suggest that you sell the whole campus. What you might consider doing is entering into a long-term lease for one of the buildings. Thank you. I shouldn't have said sold. The political baggage associated with selling something on campus is too heavy for anybody to bear. But a long-term lease has exactly the same economic function as a sale.
I'm going to go to Roberto and then Scott.
Well, Raymond has...
Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, that's all right. I was just going to ask
questions, and then we're going to have about a 20-minute lunch.
Okay. I was just going to ask about universities leasing buildings, and Cecil already addressed it.
Okay.
Yeah. And mine is a comment, or maybe you can answer this. I'm a board member of a community college, and we've resorted more to collaborations with other public entities. For example, the Judson Independent School District built a building on our campus to implement the early college and they put it all to bill. We provided the land, and that's become a very successful program. It's added a pipeline into our system. We've set up 3 regional centers, and in every one of the centers, those communities, the school districts or economic development foundations have set up the bricks and mortar, and we've come in and provided service. And that's becoming more and more an option for us simply because of our limitations in terms of our taxing capacity, and also the voters. We're not dependent on the state for construction funds, so we have to provide them ourselves or go through a bond issue, and that's becoming very difficult to do. So have you heard any other areas that are doing collaborations with other entities pulling together?
Yes, and they're doing, as you might expect, the low-hanging fruit. I know one school in California that's it's done 2 things. It's talked to the city, who has some parkland adjacent to it, and said, all right, we are at a competitive disadvantage in attracting teachers because the housing costs in California are so high that we're losing them to Arizona, Nevada, and Texas. So what we're going to do, because it's part of our core mission to attract teachers so that we can teach the kids, is we're going to do this public-private partnership. We're going to say, all right, city, we want you to contribute 6 acres of this park. We'll contribute 6 acres of the campus on a master lease. We'll hire an outside firm to build the housing to our specs, okay? It'll be exempt from taxes, and we're going to pass those savings with no land costs, okay? And in California, about 35 to 40% of the cost of the house is embedded in the land. So if you've got a $500,000 house, and $200,000 of that is land cost. Well, if you take away that $200,000, then you've got a $300,000 house that is more affordable to the incoming professor, and the incoming professor can live there, and then when he goes, he can sell it, but he can't take advantage of the markup. He's got to sell it for that $300,000 plus the CPI. That's the point. You can get so creative when you're not bound by the traditional tuition revenue bonds, GO bonds, the politicalization of it. And I know this is going to sound a little goofy, but actually once the legislatures, especially the key ones, realize what you're doing, they're going to be grateful, because it's going to be putting less pressure on them to provide public finance for something that they know is in permanent decline in terms of its political salability to the voters.
Well, you talked about the 3 Ds that are the driving forces. Demographics, we know that's coming.
Deficits,
we're there.
desperation.
And then the question for us is desperation. Is the level of desperation enough? So
At some point, you got to say, we got to do something new because the old ways ain't working.
By the way, I meant to say a 50-minute line.
Right.
It may be a 48, 49-minute line. Scott?
Just in sort of along that lines of creativity, I will say that in 2002 or 3, when I was in West Virginia University, we actually did approach and almost engage in a transaction for a long-term lease. Actually, it was long enough to be a constructive sale and then a lease back, and with an upfront payment based solely on the depreciation transfer. And there were extraordinary political issues that really, in the end, sort of soured that. But there are many opportunities out there, but it is not easy to do.
And let me give you perhaps a simple, for me anyway, example of why an investor might do what I suggested doing in terms of long-term leasing. Let's assume that there's a dormitory that's just been built, so it doesn't have any repair and maintenance or anything like that associated with it. What it represents to a private investor is an income stream over the next 60 years. And the reliability of that income stream is pretty doggone good because the universities aren't going anywhere. If anyway, they're getting bigger and bigger, and kids are always going to want to go to school, I think. And so the investor comes in and he says, okay, what is 60, plus the depreciation, what is 60 years worth of that income stream worth? And the negotiation goes around and say, all right, what kind of discount rate do you apply to that 60 years worth of income to come up with a net present value? Because that net present value is what I'm going to pay you today as an investor for the right to receive that much income over the next 60 years. And that downstroke at the closing is the found money that I'm talking about that could then be used for nanotechnology or to repair other buildings for which there's not repair and maintenance money.
On that note, I think unless there's any further burning questions, it's been a great discussion, so I almost hate to cut it off. But we do have
Great
lunch.
listeners. Thank you very much.
Those of you speakers and panelists who can stay with us for the afternoon, you're welcome to do so and participate in our small groups. And Guy, Peter, Harvey, and Cecil, we really appreciate the expertise and experience you brought to us.
Let's begin organizing these. And what I'd like you to do is, as I go through here, I might have missed some that are similar, but if you'll look at your own boards and make sure that we've gotten all of those that might be underlined. The first one I want to start with, A, is the use of the public-private partnerships to create alternative sources of capital, for example, housing, central plants, parking, etc. I saw this in Fred's group. I saw it over in this group, which I can't remember, this public-private partnership. There wasn't any more detail here. Anybody else on any of the other boards have something that pertains to the public-private partnership that I've missed? Yes, sir?
We did, but I just, one person here, I would like to see them give my board the courage to think about it.
Okay.
That's a good suggestion.
We didn't have it in our board, but for community colleges, for example, in San Antonio, we're trying to build an administrative building. Our ability to go out for a bond issue is becoming severely limited because of the recession and other factors. This is one option that we are going to look at for the future.
Okay. Any other comments on the public-private partnerships generally? All right. What are the chances of success of public partner, based on what you heard today, and obviously where you need to, well, I think you're at the desperation stage is what you were saying. What are the chances of success of the public partner, private-public partnerships? Yes.
I think it depends on the circumstances. For some institutions, it's high. For others, the larger systems, it probably isn't real practical. It's an option, though, that should be made available to institutions to evaluate.
Enabling sort of legislation.
Right.
And is there enabling legislation needed to make that a more viable tool? I mean, because, there are private dorms that have been built on campuses in Texas, so there's some that's already happening.
It worked for us if there was a state agency that gave it to us.
I think we already have.
Hey, hold on, because I'm hearing several comments. I want to make sure that we get them up here. And I don't even know who was talking up here. Rich, you had started that?
I finished.
Jesse,
okay, and Fred, I heard, is there enabling legislation?
I just asked the question, does that require enabling legislation? And Jesse was responding to that.
My comment was if there was some oversight body that gave board sort of took them off the hook and looked at it. We made one bad deal like that, got out of it, and now we won't ever get back into it. But we learned so much that we could now.
Now.
So it's not, is it enabling legislation or enabling cover?
It enabling coverage.
Okay.
It's okay.
I understand.
Somebody just say, this is a good deal.
So now the chances of success for those that it would be appropriate for, and you said the larger institutions, it would be easier for them than the smaller ones, or did I get that?
Vice versa.
I think there are probably fewer opportunities that make sense for the larger institutions. But I think, and they're deal specific, they're campus specific, and so I think finding ways to encourage ongoing review of these makes sense. But again, it really is, there is absolutely no one size that will fit every circumstance.
It's not the kind of thing that I can see centralizing somehow, because the thing that makes it so viable is the creativity of the partnership, right? And how it fits a given campus or institution.
Okay.
But at the same time, I think it's directly how easy it's done and how short-term versus long-term is directly proportional to the combination of some formula of desperation and political reality.
So for those where it's appropriate, what are the chances of successfully using it now with the information you have? High? High, medium, low, high? I'm hearing high. Okay. And the financial implications, if you can use it, are they high, medium, or low?
High. They're high. The return is high, I think.
And last time we added cost versus benefit. So the cost of doing this versus the benefit to the system or the university, high, medium, or low. The cost. Is it high?
High.
The cost high or the benefit high?
Cost is low. The benefit is
High.
high. Okay. And you just said creative and quicker turnaround. So that
Yeah, one of the things that we don't measure very well, but one of the reduced costs or increased benefits is getting more facilities done quicker, better, faster. In other words,
like toll
if it takes you 10 years to get it done through the legislature, and you can get it done in 2 years through a public-private partnership, what's the value of those 8 years?
Time value of money.
Got it. Okay.
You also have the higher cost to the student, though, to offset some of that.
Okay. So in
understand
terms
the
of
cost
time, is there anything
part of that.
relative here in terms of length of time for implementation? I think we were looking at immediate, 6 months out, 2 years out.
There's some of that already going on, so implementation is immediate and episodic.
I don't have an E up here for episodic. You guys, okay. All right, let's then skip to B, which I saw outsourcing auxiliary service concessions. I want to make sure I got this right. Link facilities to mission, and it had outsourcing. Are those the same things? I wasn't sure. Sometimes y'all leave out nouns and verbs that are critical to me, and I can't quite tell. So this is outsourcing.
The only difference I hear, one of them is they both deal with non-mission critical services, auxiliary services, or auxiliary functions. The difference is one talked about services, the other talked about facilities.
I think the key, you just pointed out the key phrase, it's non-mission critical services or facilities.
Right. Roberto, what were you?
Well, I think Brenda came up with the consolidation of certain backroom operations, and that's kind of related to that. Or is that's not what you meant? I think we were talking about it could fall, and you can consolidate it or contract that out, or look at alternative means of each individual campus or each individual system providing those services.
Okay, so you're seeing this as part of B? What I was looking at was D was this. What I was seeing was this statewide effort to save based on opportunities for joint purchase, and I was categorizing all of these. Does this fit under there or not?
You talking about statewide?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. I'm just trying to give a broad category here. Yeah, this was statewide energy purchasing, but it could be anything, using state controller or general land office, not setting up a separate entity for it. And so I was trying to group, this was D. This had facilitate energy saving measures, opportunities for joint purchase, consolidate certain backroom operations. So I was lumping all of those together.
Well,
I want to make sure
some of those strategies are strategies that could be done at the campus or system level, and some of those directly imply doing it on a statewide basis.
Well, and on energy purchasing, to some extent, the land office is already involved. I mean, they have contracts that are available to all entities. I mean, the challenge with energy, particularly with gas, it's not just the purchase, it's the transportation mechanism. They're not always linked. And sometimes there's aggregation. You do get benefits to a certain level, and then after that, the benefits are really very marginal, and you've got some additional complexity. But on the energy purchasing, I mean, the land office has a contract. Some of our campuses have utilized it. All have an opportunity to. Others have found it less.
You don't have an opportunity if you're in a regulated
That's true, that's the other issue, that's right, good, that's right.
Denton is in a regulated area, so we have to pay what...
That's right, and there are some exemptions, if you're in a regulated municipality, you can't, so there are some obstacles, I guess, in further expanding it, but I've been impressed coming from another state which was less, actually more regulated and less free in terms of how many opportunities we've had for kind of that collective purchasing and aggregation of some of our energy contracts.
So if we look at overall, let's just skip B for a second, because we went from, if we, in Fred's group, we had collective, multi-institutions of higher educations or systems, procurement of goods and services.
Then I put it, for example, also the community colleges could band together in one or more groups. So that didn't necessarily presume that the collective procurement, at least not in all areas, would be most effective statewide. It might be multiple institutions as in a system, or it might be multiple systems. It's hard to, as someone was saying in our group, A&M and UT already have pretty large economies of scale. There are some areas where they may not benefit if it was a statewide collective, whereas if you took some of the smaller institutions or smaller systems, you could create maybe the same buying power that UT and A&M enjoy today.
Another dimension there, Fred, is to include the public schools. I mean, if we could, benefit from a larger pool of people, like in Bear County, we have a consolidation like that, and it increased our buying power significantly. That's good collaboration.
This is a bit of an overlap with the May agenda. I mean, we'll hear some more on this topic in May as well, but it came up quite a bit today because of the cost of operating facilities.
So the collective procurement, in terms of the potential for successful implementation, where would y'all put that? High, medium, and low? This is going to take some work somewhere. Somebody's coordinating, right? Talking to somebody else. High, medium, or low? Chance of success. High?
We're already doing it in certain areas across the state. I mean, it's just a continuation of what's already taking place.
It's a sort of, it depends. If you were to mandate a statewide procurement policy, it would be difficult. But if you were to find a way to better enable and encourage what's already begun, then it will be much less difficult.
Okay.
And we're not recommending it first.
And therefore, the financial impact, if appropriately implemented, would be
Right.
high, medium, or low? Just medium? Okay. And
Not as much money as it.
All the low hanging fruit.
Yeah, the easiest.
Mike said it's not as much money as it sounds like it should be. Okay, so the cost versus the benefit of doing this. So you get Bayer County, all the public schools, junior college, community college there, what? What's the cost of doing this, of actually coordinating this? Is it low, medium, or is this a high cost item? Can't tell you?
I think it's low, because there's already some vehicles that are already doing it, and just encouraging the expansion of that. I wouldn't want to reinvent and set up a new agency.
Right.
Where have I heard that idea recently?
Well, and so what I'm hearing then is then the benefit must not be real high. You already said it's not high, so it's maybe a low medium benefit, L plus.
Beyond what's already happening.
I don't hear a lot of enthusiasm on this one.
Well, I think there's two areas where it may have higher benefit, two that occur to me. Again, not necessarily statewide, but it's in energy and utility costs, and possibly, thanks to the federal government, health insurance. Those are two areas that I heard mentioned over and over again that may benefit from these economies of scale.
Okay. Healthcare. Okay.
I think, again, it's very specific area.
Respect of their location.
Some things where we're doing, UT has done some. They saved a bunch of money by doing it. We're doing it in some areas where we're doing a better job, but we're not saving any money. And so, if the benefit is just money, but there's sometimes we're just doing a better job with the money you're already spending.
Okay. So we have D kind of taken care of. We're going back to this, these seem to be almost overlapping, but the outsourcing, the non-mission critical services and facilities, the outsourcing of that, which I had on Fred's, and I also had over here linking facilities to mission outsourcing. Talk to me a little bit more about that. Is there anything we need to add, or anybody else have something on their board that matches this that I missed?
Well, that's different than D. I think that's, that can be anything from the example that Guy Bailey gave us of outsourcing printing in order to free up a 30,000 square foot facility in the middle of campus, to asking yourself, there are private entities that can better manage and produce a better return on parking. So in other words, that some of these may be facility related, parking, transit services, like busing students around. Food facilities we've already talked about. What is it that is currently being managed by our institutions that could be better managed by somebody whose business it is to do X? And then what that would produce back to the university for awarding that concession.
Okay. So truly non-mission critical, and I think we have whose is this? Where are you? So, tell me about this one so I'll make sure that I've covered this. Link facilities to mission, and then we have a little line here that says outsourcing. What does this mean, and where does it fit? Are you talking about the same thing or not?
We're basically, a lot of it's the same thing. When we started talking about outsourcing, it's talking about like bookstore and food services and different things, print shops.
Okay. So you are basically talking about the same thing.
Well, I think part of that is we started off saying, like in the earlier presentation, that a very tight link between your academic planning and your strategic and facilities planning is critical to using your money wisely, however you come by it, to know what you're doing and why you're doing it for a long time, as opposed to ad hoc facilities planning.
So maybe that starts getting into, who was this? This was Raymond's group, where we were really talking about Dr. Kaiser's model. Is that what you're saying? Mm-hmm. Okay, the master planning idea. Okay, let's complete B for a second, this outsourcing of auxiliary services. Chances of successfully implementing something like that? I guess that goes also back to here, though.
Yeah.
These are interrelated.
And people are doing it today.
So the chances of doing that are high. The financial impact, where it's appropriate, could be high. Agreed?
High.
Okay. So it's basically the same as this one. The cost of it, relatively low to the benefit that would be high. Rick, you're shaking your head. You make me nervous. I don't know. What do you think?
I think the cost of it can be low to the institution. I think it's something for non-core functions that you can do at relatively, you can enhance the service and lower your costs.
Okay.
The difference between the two is that in one instance you're talking about public-private partnerships to build new facilities, create new things, and then in this latter, the reason the cost is lower is because you're talking about taking something that's already existing and spinning it off.
Okay. All right. Got it. Okay, let's go to C very quickly. Enhance utilization of existing new space through flexible design standards, student-centered scheduling, relocation of non-core functions, and where I saw something like was here, incentives tied to greater utilization of facilities, and here, space utilization of, I guess this is buildings, partnerships of sector, dual enrollment examples. Do those all mean the same thing, or am I smoking something funny from the 60s that I forgot about?
I don't know about that, but
help me with this.
I think we meant the space utilization is the same thing.
You do think it's the same thing? Thank goodness. I thought I was having a flashback. Okay. This is being recorded, isn't it? just...
You were having what you imagine a flashback.
There's a statute of
It might have been. I've heard a lot, read a lot of that word. You're right. Come to the rescue. Thank you, Mike. Okay, space utilization. Boy, you got me on that one again. Anything else on here that matches, that I have not put a C by? I don't think so. I don't see anything.
No.
So let's talk about, and Fred, that was on yours. Raymond, this was on yours. Let's talk about that one, flesh it out. What bullets do we want to add to that?
Well, this is one that was kind of a broad area with different tools or tactics underneath it. And Ray was the inspiration for this one, so I'm going to let Ray amplify.
Oh, y'all were in the same group, so that one couldn't have been yours. Okay, sorry.
Well, we talked before this morning when the speakers talked about Hong Kong using their their classroom buildings all hours of the day, 6-7 days a week. So I think that we need to look at how we can more effectively utilize our space rather than having classrooms sit empty. That's number one. Number two, I think that there can be, going back to what Mike McKinney said during that conversation, some of these buildings can be designed to be more flexible and handle multi-departments or multi-uses. Not all of them, but certainly some of them can. Thirdly, I think that in the selection process for the design team, we need to do a better job of selecting architects, design teams that can get us there.
I guess like Cecil was talking about, where people who are experienced in this area, and that's what you're... Okay.
Yeah, well, too often we let the design, the exterior, the facade, if you will, the look from the street, the curb appeal, control the design of the building as opposed to the function controlling the design of the building.
Got it.
And really that first bullet point probably could have been better worded to say create design standards for greater flexibility.
Okay.
Or design standards for flexibility so that buildings could serve multiple purposes.
Okay. Anything else you want to say about that one?
Well, and Gregory had brought up the student-centered scheduling, because one of the reasons that we find it in this country difficult to use our buildings 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, is because we can't get faculty to teach all those hours. But if we scheduled our facilities around the needs of the students and hired to that, then that might change that dynamic.
Okay. So, what are the chances of a successful implementation of this? I want to start backwards. This is is this long-term or short-term? This
Long-term.
It's long-term. Okay. Try a little different approach here. And is the cost of this low or is it high? Relatively speaking.
The cost is low. The buildings are already built. It's just overcoming the inertia of our current practices.
I think one of the key policy questions is, do you create a new utilization standard and then just say, okay, this is the state policy, go figure out how to do it, which would create a lot of stress, or do you create a set of incentives and tools and then leave it up to the individual institutions and systems?
Well,
that was our key word on the third screen there, incentives. Incentives.
Where?
Right there, where it says incentives.
Yeah.
How about that? And I put a C.
There can be a different tuition structure for taking classes on Saturday and Friday than having the high peak Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday.
I thought it was normal to take classes on Saturday.
At our colleges, we have just finished a $450 million bond issue, and everybody's pressing us to do another bond issue. But before we were going to do that, we did a building capacity study to see how the classrooms were being used. And we're going room by room, and we're finding out that we may not need to do a bond issue. And so that's going to save the taxpayers a bunch of money. And eventually we'll probably grow there. But at least we can say with people with a certainty, we've got the capacity. We just need to be a little more creative in our scheduling.
I think there's a lot to be said for that. Just as a little war story, in our firm, we moved offices, and we had all this noise about not having enough conference room. So the interior designer came in for a week and monitored all the rooms and monitors people's movement. We had more conference rooms than we needed. So there's a lot of war stories out there.
Just to add to that, anecdotally, Guy Bailey, before he left, said that he plans to personally walk through all the facilities on the Texas Tech campus just to see how the space is being used. And I think if we encouraged all of our institutions, CEOs, and facilities executives, et cetera, to do that, and as somebody at our table said, mandate that they take at least 2 elected officials with them. We would generate a long list of good ideas.
Don't forget Guy's point. He went by very quickly that the departments are going to have to be responsible for paying for their space, which causes them to look at it differently. And he also raised, sort of outside the meeting, that there are faculty that have research space that aren't actually don't have grants anymore.
Right.
So when part of his process is not just the classrooms, but do you really deserve the lab space any longer?
Yeah, it was...
Cost allocation.
Yeah. The thing that caught me was that he said there's no incentive for them to try to reduce the space. There's only incentive for them to increase.
I think that's a critical component is the cost allocation.
Okay, so
interdepartment grants.
So as we're moving backwards then, the benefit to doing this, we said the cost was low, the benefit would be...
I think the benefit's high.
It'd probably be high, so the financial impact overall is big. Okay, now the chances of successfully doing this.
Well, it varies according, there's a lot of different components there, and maybe one of the things that wouldn't have to be long-term and could be a high chance of success would be to require the institutions to allocate rental charge for facilities to the departments. And that might drive behavior just by itself.
I think that's...
What do you think, Rich?
I think that's an outstanding, because if we're looking at an era without TRVs, there has to be some mechanism for reallocation of funds to some kind of capital fund, either within a campus or within a system. And you're right, there's no incentive for anybody to be efficient in their utilization, no single department to be efficient in their utilization of space. Until people have to start paying rent for it, they'll think about it. And if you can, and that's, again, you can offer great rent deals for Saturday. Now, some school, like community colleges, may be busy on Saturday, so they may offer the discount in the day, so it has to be on a campus-by-campus basis. But there's got to be some relationship between cost and utilization.
We have a tuition break for between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because that's when it's our downtime. And we're hoping to spur more utilization in that time frame of the day. Works.
So we've got to tie facility cost to user and utilization rate.
And I would say what President Bailey says, and we were just talking, stay tuned, okay? Because we recruited Guy in, he's doing a great job. In the regions, we are very enthusiastic and we are hopeful, but this is going to roll out this fall. and we'll see if there's not pushback from, the old whose ox is getting gored, okay? Which departments are going to, so stay tuned. It's a work in process.
So the fan is being turned on, but
we know we have to do something, and we've been talking about space utilization and this, differential tuition based on off-peak hours, and we've been talking about that for a long time. It's just hard to implement in the current.
I understand Guy was just going to send everybody over to the Health Science Center to talk to Elmo. And
I'm not talking that system.
Mike?
Realist. Turn in all of this, when we start talking about the financial implications of what I call, we start with no baseline.
Right.
This enhancing utilization, sitting around, that sounds like a good idea. I don't know for sure that even if you are better at it, that it makes any difference.
Exactly, yeah.
And so I just think that's one of the things you have to be careful about is we have to build in some local or decision-making arrangements. We talked last time or time before, one of the possibilities is not that we have classes on Saturday and Sunday, but that we don't have classes on Friday or Saturday or Sunday. And maybe that saves more money than having them paying the air conditioning bill. I'm just saying you've got to have, there's two different ways of looking at the utilization. Well, maybe we shouldn't have summer school. Maybe everybody ought to be on nine-month contract, and we only have certain universities that get to have summer school. That's what they do in the public school system. Every high school is not open for summer schools, only certain ones.
so instead of having 25 or 33% of the student body operating at 80, 90% of it.
Again, if we're going to do radical things, if we're going to make it work, you got to do radical things.
But it brings me back to the same point. If we allocate costs of facilities, to the users, then might those users be the ones who make those determinations?
Oh, I think cost allocation method I think that's a good idea, and that is a change. We do some of that, but we don't do enough of it to where it makes any difference. If you don't do 100% of it, it doesn't work.
But Mike, wouldn't your concerns be addressed as long as there's an evaluation of utilization, not just based on tradition, but let's evaluate whether we should be open on, there should be some kind of cost evaluation, effectiveness evaluation, determine whether we should be open on Saturdays, whether we should be open Saturdays, or whether we should be closed Friday and Saturdays, but just not continue business as usual, I guess.
Well, and I already think that's my job, so that's the process. I've already got 9 people that expect me to do that stuff. And if I'm not doing it, frankly, they'll fire me and find somebody who will. So I just want to make sure that we're not trying to design something that
doesn't work. Yeah.
And I also don't want to design something that makes me wait for permission to do it.
And I would, one other factor, and I don't know how to get at it other than what you've suggested, but the only caveat I have, for example, on the cost utilization, is that if you are a I don't know, any campus, a smaller campus, without those data readily available, I would hate to impose a level of bureaucracy to allow, in order to move forward, unintentionally. If the mandate is, you need to charge rent to create a factor that makes it, that delays some of the implementations and raises costs. And I'm hesitant to say it because I still think it's a good idea. I don't know how else to get at it. I think we ought to all be doing it. Many of us are. It's less about the data and more about the decision making and the will to do it. But I think in some cases it may be about the data. I just don't. So.
Right, maybe we should look at, we're doing a lot of good things already, and take it from that perspective, and then just try to do it better, and have a roadmap on how to do it better, rather than try to legislate or mandate. Like a yearly review of utilization, report to the board, something like that, and report efficiencies that kind of thing. It would help me as a board member, for example, if my chancellor came back to us every year and said, we've done the study, here are the results, here is the efficiencies that we've realized. And I think that might be a better way to go, is that, all right, here we are, we're doing some good things, let's just do them better, this is the way to do it.
At University, when I was at University of Texas, we had some departments who wanted new clinic space because they said they were always full. We had graduate students, and they spent a week, and they compared the schedule. And they physically walked into the room, wrote down either the number of students or if that room was occupied. It was just a checkbox. It was a 1 week survey. It was done by the graduate students. It was part of their I guess they were writing a thesis at the time. And we found out that we have some places in the same building that are overutilized and some that are underutilized. And that's what I'm saying is, to enhance utilization, I think enhance is probably the right word. It's not necessarily increase. I think it is enhance. But I think that if we would make an assignment, it's very easy. I know UT already have the form that you can take it. It would take you but a week to find out how many people are actually utilizing the space. I know we know what the schedule is, but I also know that the class that has 200 scheduled in it doesn't meet every day.
Right. And you guys report some of that data here. In fact, so that some of that could be generated directly from here that you could start from.
Yeah, but it's not assigned to a specific department.
No, it's not assigned. That's what I'm saying. It would be
that even if we wouldn't charge rent, which I still think would be good to do. But even if you didn't do that, just having all of that data and available and in an understandable
just knowing
format,
the cost per square foot to operate facilities and allocating it.
You're that far from knowing that.
Whether you do
You've
it
got a
through
lot of that information. Just that element.
Does it make sense for that to be a policy recommendation and then left up to the different institutions and systems on how to implement it?
That data set works.
Sorry?
Would that data set be useful to y'all? I mean, one thing as SPUPSI, one of the things we've sworn to do is to decrease the number of reports that we have to make instead of increase.
I think what I'm saying is it's what we report to us as a base for it. I think the decisions really need to be made at the campus level. I mean, we're not going to interact with department chairs, and that's would be.
And quite frankly, if you're starting up a new program, you may say, okay, I know we're going to suffer a loss during the first couple of years while this program is getting started. But at least somebody's making a sound decision that we're going to incur those costs.
Well, and remember when we started this process, we said the report, we're going to try to synthesize, 3 to 5 key recommendations that may be agency or legislative oriented, but at the same time we want to have a section for best practices and no-brainers in order to try to take what the institutions are already doing that's working and try to spread the word and find some way to replicate it. We can't mandate everything. There's no question about that. Dennis?
Observation. To the extent that the prioritization system that the coordinating board historically used to put facilities in some kind of order and say, here's the list, and you draw the line, to the extent that that's not functioning, then nothing about this conversation matters. Because utilization is, because the campuses, if they can go get another building, well, we'll go get another building and drive their utilization down, okay? And if utilization is, in fact, a factor in whether you get a new building or not, you'll get utilization. So part of this is the discipline in the capital funding process. And if there is no discipline in the capital funding process, there won't be any utilization either. Not
exactly right.
Huh?
You're exactly right.
That was that flow chart process that Harvey was talking about.
As long as we're doing research, though, I'll tell you, the research it's like a gas. It expands to fill the available volume. As long as we put it,
As long as the
if you
space is there,
concentrate on
you'll
the
use
teaching
it.
part, that's right. But as long as I get to put research in there, I need more space, and I don't even know how much space I have.
And we built very little teaching space. Very little.
And every square foot will be used somehow.
During,
But, you know, if you've got the square foot, it will
during the past few months with the healthcare debate, for suicidal reasons, I read 2 books on healthcare. And one of the, no, it's not. Not good for the blood pressure, I can assure you. But one of the books talked about some research done on a hospital in the West. And what that hospital did was, rather than mandating how a certain procedure should be done, you know, a certain operation needed to be done in different ways to do it, what they did was they published the data on how different doctors did it and the outcomes in the readmits and all that sort of stuff. And just by publishing the data, without any mandates, within a matter of weeks, all the doctors gravitated towards the procedure that was the most successful. And so, listening to what Roberto said, rather than trying to mandate something either from the coordinating board or from the legislature, just mandating publishing of the data might be enough to make us all more disciplined in how we utilize our resources. Just something to think about.
And you brought that up only on 2.5 hours of sleep, I might add. That was darn good. I like that. Y'all know he took the red eye in last night. The man has had no sleep and comes up with a brilliant idea. Mike, what's the matter with you?
No wonder you hit me with that spoon.
Okay. That takes us probably to this one as the last one that is back to Dr. Kaiser's capital planning model. What are we going to say about this? Because that's huge, right? Weren't you in this group?
No.
No. Who's in this group? Once y'all get separated, I can't find you anymore. You're hiding from me. So this. And also, Jesse, you said that this master survey of all campuses
that should
goes
be
before
first.
too.
Yes.
Okay, but this is the capital planning model.
I think that recommendation was made today. We've talked about it before. We've had, I think, made recommendations from the last time we studied capital improvements. It deals with a huge amount of the expenditures in the future, and it comes even before this utilization issue.
Is this all the deferred maintenance issues that we're really talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, and we're in here. You were talking about statewide.
Yes.
Okay.
Let's somehow recommend to catch up, and then after that have a plan how to stay up a little better.
Well, and yeah, there were the prior recommendation of creating a matching fund is probably not politically viable in the short term. So the question is, how do we? There's two-part problem. How do we fund what we've got now, and then how do we keep it from getting worse as we go forward?
And that's one of the big costs of higher education.
You remember how many years ago it was, 4 years ago or 6 years ago, the coordinating board had a very rigorous process for application of tuition revenue bonds. You had to justify the need. It was based on utilization. It was based on the space model. It was graded partly on how much participation there was from the institution, from the university. I thought it was an outstanding process. They went through and they ranked them, and the legislature promptly ignored every single bit of it. Well, I mean, in fairness, the legislature doesn't have put the other hat on. They don't have control of a whole lot of things. This is one thing they do have control on, and I understand they're being hesitant to give control up. But that process ranked according to need and interest. I thought it was a fair process. The problem is, those of us who didn't show up on the process went around the process, went directly to the senators or ran around the process. But what was set up 6 years ago was a great idea. If we could figure out how to put teeth in that process, I think that would address a whole bunch of it.
What was the process called?
It was just called, we just evaluated the TRB proposals, and
Waited and prioritized all the...
I think it's fair to say that the senators followed our recommendations to the letter, except for when it came to institutions in their districts.
And actually, and maybe I am just...
Warren is laughing, he was in the middle of the process.
And maybe I really am tilting at windmills, but I think we also need to push a little farther. I think we have to find some way to add predictability into the capital planning process. Not only in sort of how to evaluate against some agreed upon threshold, but that is linked upon an understanding of sort of what we can plan for in some sort of parameters being available from different sources over a period of time, and how that ties into some of the state and or institutional strategic objectives. Because even with that process, it was challenging because it was a point in time. We aren't sure when and if TRBs are going to come around again, so that may, knowing that would change perhaps the importance of some of our allocation decisions. And so I don't know if it's feasible in any way, and we've talked about that in a variety of different ways to do it, but some way of providing predictability to the long-term capital planning process, to me, is a first step, and then some discipline and rigor. And then it really does begin to build upon itself and motivates behavior.
That's well put. In fact, this study that was done in April of 2006, which I just recently read, makes that exact point. That the problem is the predictability, the funding, and so I think we need to think in terms of what if we never see another TRB? What are we going to do? How do we create a predictable public funding facilities?
Cities have sinking funds.
That being said, we are 7 minutes past 3, and I promised several of you that I would end by 3, and I was so fascinated with the discussion, I completely lost track. I apologize. Anything else? I'll get these notes to you.
Thanks.
Done? Good meeting.
I'm not going to be here.
Relevant to see. We don't get any money for buildings.
Figure out what your